She was once a maid ridiculed by the entire upper class, an anonymous, impoverished girl kneeling to mop the floors in the five-star hotel of New York's most ruthless mafia boss. But tonight, as the limousine door opens and she steps into the city's most glamorous ball, all the laughter dies down. Because no one knows that the girl they once humiliated holds the secret that could destroy their entire criminal empire. Follow the story to the end, like and comment with the name of the city you're watching to let me know how far my story has progressed. The ballroom smelled like old money and fresh lies. 300 guests filled the grand hall of the Ashworth estate on the Upper East Side, their laughter bouncing off marble floors and crystal chandeliers that hadn't been cleaned in decades because nobody alive had the clearance to touch them. Women in gowns worth more than most people's mortgages leaned against men whose hands had signed both charity checks and death warrants in the same afternoon. Waiters in white gloves moved between clusters of conversation like ghosts, invisible, silent, trained never to make eye contact. This was the annual DeLuca Gala. Not a charity event, not a celebration. It was a census, a roll call. Every family that mattered in the Eastern Seaboard's underworld showed their face here once a year to prove they were still breathing, still relevant, still dangerous enough to deserve an invitation. The ones who didn't show up were either dead or wished they were. Damien DeLuca stood at the top of the curved staircase, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a glass of bourbon he hadn't sipped. 29 years old, 6'2", jaw like it had been carved from the same stone as the mansion's foundation. His suit was charcoal, custom cut, and probably cost what a schoolteacher made in 3 months. But it wasn't the suit that made people look twice. It was the way he wore silence like a weapon. While everyone else in the room performed, laughing too loud, shaking hands too hard, complimenting wives they wanted to sleep with, Damien just watched. His dark eyes moved across the ballroom the way a hawk tracks a field of mice. Patient, calculating, cold. He had inherited the DeLuca empire at 24 after his father ate a bullet in a parking garage in Newark. Not suicide, business. Within 6 months, Damien had found the 3 men responsible and made them disappear so thoroughly that even their dental records were useless. He didn't brag about it. He didn't need to. Silence, he'd learned early, was louder than any gunshot. His right-hand man, Marco Ferretti, climbed the stairs and stood 1 step below him because Marco always stood 1 step below, even when there were no stairs. Loyalty came in different shapes. Marco's was geometric, precise, measured, always aware of the angles. "Everyone's asking about your announcement," Marco said, keeping his voice low. "You've got the Calabrese family nervous. Vito keeps pulling his collar like he's being strangled." Damien almost smiled. Almost. "Good. You sure about this, boss? Bringing her here? The guys are talking. They think you've lost your mind." "The guys don't get paid to think." Marco exhaled through his nose. He'd known Damien since they were 15, running cigarettes through Bensonhurst. Even back then, Damien never explained himself until after the damage was done. "At least tell me why." "A maid, Damien. You're dragging a hotel maid into a room full of people who would kill her for breathing the same air. She spilled wine on me 3 weeks ago." "I have a long memory." Marco stared at him. There was something else going on behind those dark eyes, something Marco couldn't read, and that unsettled him more than any rival family's threat ever had. He swallowed the rest of his question and adjusted his cufflinks. "Car's 5 minutes out," he said. Damien lifted his bourbon, finally took a sip, and let the burn sit on his tongue. Below him, the ballroom hummed with anticipation. He'd made the announcement an hour ago, casually, between introductions, like it was an afterthought. Told the room he'd invited a special guest tonight, a hotel maid, the cleaning girl from the Monarch Grand, one of his family's flagship properties in Midtown. He said her name, Elena Vale, and watched 300 faces twist into expressions of amused contempt. They laughed the way rich people laugh at poor people. Not with joy, with relief. Relief that they weren't her. Damien's jaw tightened at the memory of it. Their laughter, their ease. He didn't know why it bothered him. He'd orchestrated the whole thing. He wanted them to laugh. He wanted them hungry for the spectacle. But something about the sound, the casual cruelty of it, the way it rolled through the room like a wave of glass, stuck in a place he hadn't felt anything in years. He pushed the thought down and checked his watch. 4 minutes. Across the ballroom, beneath a portrait of Damien's dead grandfather, Senator Richard Ashby stood with a champagne flute and a smile that could have been painted on. Mid-60s, silver hair swept back like a Kennedy impersonator, and a handshake so firm it was practically a threat. He'd been in the pocket of the DeLuca family for 15 years, which meant he'd been in the pocket of every family that had ever shared a table with the DeLucas. His voting record read like a mob wish list: zoning exemptions, construction permits, buried investigations. He was untouchable, not because of the law, but because of the men standing behind it. "So Damien's bringing in a maid for entertainment," Ashby murmured to the woman beside him. "Bold move, even for him." The woman didn't respond. She was Lucia Moretti, 71 years old, the widow of Enzo Moretti, who had once controlled every port from Boston to Baltimore. She wore black because she always wore black, and she held a glass of red wine she never drank because it reminded her of blood, and she'd seen enough of that. Her eyes, sharp as broken ice, tracked the front entrance. "You don't know the girl," Lucia said quietly. Ashby turned. "Should I?" "No." Lucia's mouth barely moved. "And that's exactly what worries me." The front doors opened, not slowly. They swung wide, both at once, pushed by the doorman with a kind of train drama that the Ashworth estate was known for. Cold November air rushed in and caught the edges of the nearest tablecloths, and for a moment the entire ballroom held its breath the way a theater does when the curtain rises. A black Escalade idled at the bottom of the mansion steps, its engine humming like a heartbeat. The driver's side door opened first. One of Damien's men, ex-military, expressionless. He walked to the rear passenger door and opened it. Nothing happened for 3 seconds. 3 seconds is a long time when 300 people are watching. Then a silver heel touched the cobblestones. The woman who stepped out of the car was not the woman anyone expected. Elena Vale, the name on the hotel's payroll, the maid who changed sheets and scrubbed bathroom tiles and kept her eyes on the floor, stood at the base of the Ashworth steps in a silver gown that caught the light from the mansion's chandeliers and threw it back like a blade. Her dark hair, usually pulled into a tight ponytail beneath a service cap, fell in loose waves past her shoulders. Her posture was straight, her chin lifted, her eyes fixed on the open doors ahead of her with the kind of focus that belongs to surgeons and soldiers. She wasn't beautiful in the way magazine covers teach you to recognize beauty. She was beautiful in the way a storm is beautiful, the kind that makes you forget to run. The laughter stopped. It didn't fade. It stopped, like someone had reached into the room and pulled the sound out by its throat. Elena climbed the steps one at a time, unhurried, and the click of her heels on stone was the loudest thing in the world. When she crossed the threshold and entered the ballroom, 300 heads turned and 300 mouths went silent, and the only movement in the room was the slow trembling of champagne in glasses held by hands that suddenly weren't steady. Damien watched from the top of the staircase. His fingers tightened around his bourbon glass. This was not the woman who had spilled wine on his sleeve 3 weeks ago. That woman had been invisible, small, nervous, apologetic. She had stammered through an apology while her hand shook, and he had looked through her the way he looked through all the service staff, like she was furniture with a heartbeat. But this woman, this version of her, walked into his world like she owned the deed. Marco leaned close. "Boss, I see her." "That's not a maid." Damien said nothing. His pulse, steady through every firefight and funeral he'd ever attended, quickened by exactly 1 beat. Elena moved through the center of the ballroom, and the crowd parted for her without being asked, the same way a current splits around a stone. She didn't look left or right, didn't acknowledge the whispers erupting in her wake like small fires. She walked straight to the bar, placed both hands on the counter, and ordered a whiskey neat without looking at the bartender. Dominic Calabrese, patriarch of the Calabrese family, and a man who had personally ordered 11 deaths that he would admit to, set down his cigar and turned to his youngest son. "Find out who dressed her, find out who paid for it, and find out why the hell a cleaning girl walks like she owns a country." His son nodded and disappeared into the crowd. Damien descended the staircase, slowly, each step deliberate, each footfall a statement. The crowd turned again, watching him approach Elena the way spectators watch the final seconds of a close fight, breathless, committed, unwilling to blink. Elena didn't turn around until he was 3 feet behind her. When she did, her eyes met his without flinching, dark brown eyes that held something he hadn't expected and couldn't name. Not fear, not anger, something deeper, something that felt, absurdly, like patience. "Miss Vale." His voice was even, controlled. "I'm glad you could make it." "You didn't give me much of a choice," Elena said. Her voice was low, steady, and carried an accent he hadn't noticed before. Faint, European, buried beneath years of deliberate erasure. "Everyone has a choice. Not everyone has the luxury of pretending that's true." A ripple went through the nearest guests. Nobody spoke to Damien DeLuca like that. Nobody. His own lieutenants measured their words around him the way demolition experts measure wire. But this woman, this maid, looked at him like he was a man, not a title, and the difference was so unfamiliar it made the air feel thin. Damien's jaw worked once, twice. Then the corner of his mouth lifted by a fraction, not a smile, but the ghost of one. "You clean up well." "I do a lot of things well. You just never bothered to notice." She turned back to the bar, picked up her whiskey, and took a sip without breaking eye contact in the mirror behind the bottles. Damien stood there for a beat longer than he should have, aware that the room was cataloging every second of this exchange, aware that his reputation was being weighed in real time, and aware, for the first time in longer than he could remember, that he was not the most interesting person in the room. He walked away. Not because he wanted to, because staying would have meant admitting something he wasn't ready to name. Across the ballroom, Lucia Moretti set down her wine glass. Her hand was trembling. She leaned toward the man beside her, a gray-haired attorney named Philip Crane, who had brokered deals between families for 30 years and kept his soul by pretending he didn't know what the deals were for. "Philip." "Yes." "That girl. Look at her face." Philip adjusted his glasses and looked. Really looked. His expression didn't change, but the color left his cheeks like water draining from a tub. "That's not possible." "It is." "The Montclair girl, she died in the fire. Everyone says a lot of things." Lucia's voice was barely audible now. "Most of them are lies we agreed on." 14 years ago, the Montclair family had been one of the most powerful financial dynasties on the East Coast. Not mafia, legitimate, or at least legitimate enough to pass inspection. Theodore Montclair had built a banking empire that laundered money for half the organized crime families in New York, while maintaining a public face so clean it could have been printed on currency. His wife, Catherine, hosted fundraisers and sat on museum boards and kissed senators' wives at garden parties. They had one daughter, a quiet girl with dark eyes who loved books and hated crowds, and once told her father that money smelled like metal and fear. Then the Montclair estate burned. Officially, it was an electrical fire. Faulty wiring in the East Wing. Theodore and Catherine Montclair died in their beds. Their 14-year-old daughter was reported dead 3 days later when they found remains in the collapsed greenhouse. Case closed. Insurance paid. Funerals attended by people who had ordered the matches. But if the girl standing at the bar, the one with Theodore Montclair's jawline and Catherine Montclair's dark, unblinking stare, was who Lucia thought she was, then the remains in the greenhouse had been someone else's, and the funeral everyone attended had been a performance, and the people who had ordered the fire were standing in this very room. Lucia reached for her wine and drank for the first time in years. The dinner was served at 9 o'clock. Long tables arranged in a U-shape, white linen, candles that smelled like money. Damien sat at the head, as always. Elena had been seated at the far end, deliberately, dismissively, placed between the wife of a mid-level bookkeeper and an empty chair that was meant to remind her she didn't belong. She sat there without complaint, ate her salad, sipped her water, and waited. Senator Ashby was holding court at the center of the table, telling a story about a golf game with a federal judge that was designed to remind everyone how connected he was. His voice carried the confident boom of a man who had never been interrupted and didn't expect to start now. "And I told Judge Harrington, Richard, you worry too much. The permits will clear. They always do. And sure enough, by Thursday, the permit's cleared because you made a phone call to the zoning commissioner's office at 6:14 a.m. on Wednesday, Elena said. The table went quiet. Not gradually. Instantly. Like a switch. Ashby turned his head. His smile remained, but his eyes went dead. Excuse me? Commissioner David Partridge. You called him from a prepaid phone registered to a dry cleaning business on Lexington Avenue that doesn't exist. Elena picked up her water glass. Her hand was perfectly steady. The call lasted 4 minutes. You told him to approve the permits for the Riverside Development Project, or you would forward his browser history to his wife in the New York Post. In that order. 300 people stopped chewing. Ashby's smile cracked at the edges. Young lady, I don't know what kind of fantasy. I have the recording. The word hung in the air like a blade. I have the recording, Senator. I have the phone records. I have the commissioner's written statement, signed and notarized, that he gave to a private attorney 18 months ago when he decided his conscience weighed more than his career. Elena set her glass down. Would you like me to continue, or would you prefer to finish your story about the golf game? Ashby's mouth opened, closed. His hand moved to his lap, where it gripped his napkin so hard his knuckles turned white. Around the table, men who had spent decades building empires on unspoken agreements stared at this woman, this maid, this nobody, this girl from the hotel, and felt something they hadn't felt in years. Fear. Not the manageable fear of a business rival or a federal investigation. The primal, gut-level fear of the unknown. Because nobody knew who this woman really was, and in their world, the unknown was the only thing that killed you. Damien watched from the head of the table. His expression hadn't changed, but beneath it, behind the mask he had worn since his father's blood was still drying on the parking garage concrete, something shifted. He didn't know what Elena was doing. He didn't know how she knew what she knew. But he recognized the look in her eyes because he saw it every morning in the mirror. It was the look of someone who had nothing left to lose. And people with nothing to lose were either saviors or catastrophes, and there was never a way to tell which until the fire was already burning. The dinner continued in strained silence. Conversations resumed, but quieter now, careful, like footsteps in a minefield. Elena ate her meal and spoke to no one. She didn't need to. The damage was done. Ashby excused himself before dessert and was seen making 3 phone calls from the bathroom, with the door locked. At 10:30, the music started. A string quartet that played Vivaldi like a funeral dirge. Couples moved to the dance floor, not because they wanted to dance, but because movement felt safer than standing still under Elena's gaze. Damien found her on the terrace. She was alone, leaning against the stone railing, looking out at the Manhattan skyline like it owed her something. The wind pulled at her silver gown and her hair, and for a moment she looked like something from a myth, a figure standing at the edge of a cliff, deciding whether to jump or fly. "Who are you?" Damien said. No preamble, no politeness. Just the question, raw and direct, the way he asked questions when the answers actually mattered. Elena didn't turn. "You already know my name." "I know the name on your employee file. That's not what I asked." She was quiet for a moment. Below them, the city hummed its restless hum. Sirens, traffic, the distant bass of a nightclub that catered to people who would never be invited to a party like this. "You invited me here to humiliate me," she said. "To parade me in front of your friends so they could laugh at the poor little maid who ruined your shirt." She turned then, and her eyes caught the light from the ballroom behind him. "But you made a mistake, Damien." "I don't make mistakes. You do. You just bury them before anyone notices." She stepped closer, close enough that he could smell her perfume, jasmine and something sharper underneath, like smoke. "Your mistake was assuming I had nothing, that I was nobody, that I was safe." His pulse kicked again, 1 beat, 2. "And you're not safe?" "I am the least safe person you have ever invited into your home." They stood there, 3 feet apart, the city sprawling behind them and the ballroom full of killers and thieves glowing through the glass doors, and something passed between them that neither of them wanted and neither of them could stop. Not attraction, not yet, something more dangerous. Recognition. The feeling you get when you meet someone who operates on the same frequency of ruin that you do. Damien broke the silence first. Whatever you're doing in there, with Ashby, with whatever information you think you have, you need to understand something. These people don't get embarrassed. They get even. And even, in their vocabulary, means a shallow grave and a missing persons report. I know exactly what they do. Elena's voice didn't waver. I've been studying them for 14 years. The number hit him like a fist. 14 years. That wasn't a grudge. That was architecture. That was a life rebuilt from the ground up around a single purpose. Before he could respond, Marco appeared in the doorway, his face pale, his phone pressed against his chest like he was trying to suffocate it. Boss, we have a problem. What kind? The kind that comes with guns. The lights went out. Not a flicker. Not a brownout. Every light in the Ashworth estate, chandeliers, wall sconces, landscape lighting, the security floods that ringed the property like a crown, died at once. The string quartet stopped mid-note. Somewhere in the ballroom, a woman screamed, then another. Then the screaming was drowned out by a sound that Damien knew better than his own heartbeat. Automatic gunfire. 3 bursts. Short, controlled, professional. Not panic shooting, not warning shots. Kill shots aimed at the security detail at the front entrance. Damien grabbed Elena's arm and pulled her behind a stone column. His other hand was already under his jacket, wrapping around the grip of the Beretta he carried the way other men carried wallets. Stay down. Don't tell me what to do. Even now, even with bullets cutting through the November air and the screams of 300 people echoing off marble walls, she argued with him. And in the dark, crouched behind a column with a woman he'd met as a maid and was starting to suspect was something far more terrifying, Damien DeLuca felt the corner of his mouth lift. Marco pressed against the wall beside them, gun drawn, breathing hard. 6 shooters, maybe 8. They came through the service entrance and the east garden. Professional team. This isn't freelance. Someone paid for this. Who? I don't know yet. But boss, they cut the security feeds before the lights. Whoever planned this knew the house layout, knew our positions, knew the rotation of the guard detail. Damien's blood went cold. Not from fear, from understanding. Someone inside, he said. Marco nodded. Someone inside. Another burst of gunfire, this time closer. Inside the ballroom now. Glass shattered. A man's voice shouted commands in a language Damien couldn't place. Elena gripped the stone railing, her knuckles white, her eyes scanning the darkness with a focus that had nothing to do with panic and everything to do with calculation. They're not here for the guests, she said quietly. Damien looked at her. In the faint glow of the Manhattan skyline, her face was stripped of everything soft, everything that had made her look like a maid or a party guest or a woman in a silver gown. What was left was harder, older. The face of someone who had survived something that should have killed her and had spent every day since preparing for this exact moment. They're here for me, Elena said, and the gunfire moved closer. The gunfire came in waves, 3-round bursts that punched through the ballroom's floor-to-ceiling windows and sent crystal raining down like shrapnel. Damien kept his hand on Elena's arm, pulling her low behind the stone balustrade of the terrace as Marco crouched beside them, his Glock held against his chest, breathing through his teeth. Staircase, Damien said. Service corridor behind the East Wing kitchen. It leads to the tunnel system under the foundation. Marco shook his head. East Wing is compromised. That's where they breached. Then we go through the wine cellar. That's a dead end. It's a dead end if you don't know about the passage behind the 1987 rack. My grandfather built it during the Genovese Wars, runs 200 yards under the garden, and comes out at the carriage house on 63rd. Damien checked his magazine. 14 rounds plus 1 in the chamber. Not enough for a firefight. Enough for a retreat. Move. They moved. Elena kicked off her heels without being told, and the cold stone of the terrace bit into her bare feet as she ran in a crouch behind Damien. She didn't stumble, didn't hesitate. Her breathing was controlled, in through the nose, out through the mouth. The way someone breathes when they've trained themselves not to panic, when panic is a luxury they gave up a long time ago. Inside the ballroom, chaos had replaced elegance, tables overturned, Plates shattered across the marble floor like white bones. Guests scrambled toward exits that were blocked, screaming into phones that had no signal because the jammers the assault team had planted were doing exactly what they were designed to do. Damien caught glimpses through the glass doors as they passed. Dominic Calabrese crouched behind an overturned table with his bodyguard. Senator Ashby flat on his stomach under the head table with his hands over his ears. Lucia Moretti standing perfectly still in the center of the room like a woman who had survived worse and wasn't impressed. A bullet cracked the stone 6 inches from Elena's head. She flinched but didn't stop. Damien turned, aimed, and fired twice into the darkness of the garden. A grunt. A thud. One down. "Keep moving," he said. They reached the service door at the east corner of the terrace. Marco shot the lock. One round, precise, the deadbolt exploding inward, and they were inside, running through a narrow corridor lined with catering carts and stacked chairs. The emergency lighting hadn't kicked in, which meant the shooters had hit the backup generators too. Professionals. Well-funded. Someone had spent serious money planning this. Damien's mind was already working through the list. Who knew the estate layout well enough to plan an assault? Who knew the guard rotation? Who had the resources to hire a team this disciplined? The answer kept circling back to the same place, and every time it landed there, his stomach tightened like a fist. Family. They reached the wine cellar door. Damien punched in the code. 6 digits, his mother's birthday, because sentimentality was the only password nobody ever guessed, and the steel door clicked open. They descended into darkness. The air changed immediately. Cool, damp, heavy with the earthy smell of old oak and older stone. Thousands of bottles lined the walls and iron racks. Their labels faded. Their contents worth more than most apartments in the city. Damien led them to the back wall to a rack holding 24 bottles of 1987 Brunello that his grandfather had never intended anyone to drink. He reached behind the third bottle from the left, found the recessed lever, and pulled. The rack swung outward on hidden hinges, revealing a passage barely wide enough for 2 people abreast. The air coming from inside was cold and tasted like dirt and rust. "Go," Damien said. Elena went first, then Marco. Damien pulled the rack closed behind them and heard it lock with a sound that felt permanent. The passage was rough. Unfinished concrete walls, a floor of packed earth, a ceiling low enough that Damien had to duck. They moved single file, Marco's phone flashlight cutting a thin beam ahead of them. Nobody spoke. The only sounds were their footsteps, their breathing, and the distant muffled thud of gunfire growing fainter behind them. After what felt like 10 minutes, but was probably 3, they reached the end. A steel door with a wheel lock, like something from a submarine. Marco holstered his gun and turned the wheel. It resisted, then gave with a screech that echoed through the passage like a scream. The door opened into the basement of the carriage house, a dusty space full of old furniture covered in sheets, filing cabinets from the 1960s, and a black SUV that Damien kept gassed and ready for exactly this kind of night. Damien tossed the keys to Marco. "Drive, safe house on Atlantic Avenue. Don't take the bridge. They'll have eyes on it. Go through the tunnel." Marco caught the keys but didn't move. He was looking at Elena. His expression had shifted from the controlled blankness of a soldier in combat to something raw. Suspicion, calculation, the look of a man doing math he didn't like the answer to. "Who sent them?" Marco asked. "Not to Damien. To Elena." Elena met his eyes. Her silver gown was torn at the hem, her bare feet dirty, her hair tangled. But her posture hadn't changed. Still straight, still controlled, still the posture of someone who had spent years pretending to be smaller than she was. "You already know who sent them," she said. "I'm asking you." "The same people who killed my parents 14 years ago." She said it the way you say a fact, flat, stripped of emotion, the way a coroner reads a cause of death. "The same people who burned my family's house with us inside it. The same people who are standing in that ballroom right now pretending to be victims." The silence that followed was thick enough to taste. Marco turned to Damien. "You knew about this?" "No." "Then what the hell is happening? Who is she?" Damien looked at Elena. In the dim light of the carriage house basement, with dust floating in the beam of Marco's phone and the distant sound of sirens beginning to wail outside, he saw it clearly for the first time. The jawline, the eyes, the way she held herself like someone who had been born into rooms exactly like the one they'd just fled. "Montclair," he said. The name came out quiet, almost gentle, which was wrong because there was nothing gentle about what it meant. "You're the Montclair girl, Theodore's daughter." Elena's chin lifted, one fraction of an inch. "My name is Elena Montclair Vale, and everyone in that ballroom who laughed at me tonight had a hand in murdering my family." Marco's gun hand twitched, not toward Elena, toward the door, toward the world outside, toward the implications of what she'd just said. Because the Montclair destruction wasn't ancient history, it was foundation stone. Half the alliances in the current power structure had been built on the redistribution of Montclair assets after the fire. Money, properties, political connections, bank accounts that had been quietly absorbed into family portfolios like water into sand. If Elena Montclair was alive, if she had evidence, then every deal, every alliance, every handshake sealed over her family's grave was suddenly sitting on dynamite. "Get in the car," Damien said. "We talk while we drive." They drove. Marco behind the wheel, knuckles white on the leather, taking the Battery Tunnel south and looping through Brooklyn on streets that hadn't been important enough to warrant surveillance. Damien sat in the back with Elena. The space between them on the seat was 12 inches and felt like 12 miles. "Start talking," Damien said. Elena stared out the window. The streetlights of Red Hook painted her face in moving strips of orange and black. "What do you want to know?" "Everything, starting with how a dead girl ended up scrubbing toilets in my hotel." Her jaw tightened. He saw the muscle flex, saw the effort it took to keep her voice level. "I wasn't dead. I was 14. I woke up in the greenhouse when the fire reached the east wing. The smoke was so thick I couldn't see my hands. I broke a window panel and crawled out onto the lawn. I was barefoot then, too." She glanced down at her dirty feet and something flickered across her face. Not humor, something darker. "I ran to the groundskeeper's cottage. Martin Hale. He'd worked for my father for 20 years. He hid me in his truck, drove me to his sister's house in Pennsylvania. By morning, the news was reporting 3 bodies. My parents and me. The body they found in the greenhouse. A girl from a group home upstate, 14 years old, no family, no one looking for her. Martin paid someone at the morgue to falsify the dental records." Elena's voice didn't shake, but it slowed, like a car downshifting before a steep hill. "I don't know her name. I've spent 14 years trying to find it, and I never have. That's the thing about people nobody cares about. They disappear completely. Not even their names survive." Damien watched her face. He'd heard 1,000 lies in his life. From enemies, allies, lawyers, lovers, every one of them polished and practiced. This wasn't that. This was unpolished, rough at the edges. The kind of story that hurts to tell because it hasn't been told enough times to smooth down. "Why the hotel?" he asked. "Why my hotel?" "Because your family was involved." The words landed in the SUV like a grenade with the pin pulled. Marco's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. Damien's expression didn't change, but his hands, resting on his thighs, loose and casual a second ago, went still. "Careful," he said. "Your uncle, Victor DeLuca." Elena turned from the window and looked at him directly. "He brokered the deal. He connected the families who wanted my father's banking network with the men willing to do the work. He arranged the fire. He handled the insurance paperwork through a shell company in Delaware. And when it was done, he took 17% of the redistributed assets as a finder's fee." That's a hell of an accusation. "It's not an accusation, it's an accounting entry. I have the ledger." Damien felt something cold move through his chest. Not surprise. He'd stopped being surprised by human cruelty around the same time he'd stopped believing in clean hands. What he felt was closer to recognition. The slow, nauseating click of a puzzle piece he'd been holding for years finally finding its slot. Victor DeLuca. His father's younger brother. The man who had stood at his father's funeral with tears on his cheeks and a trembling lip and a speech about family loyalty that had made even the hardened capos wipe their eyes. The man who had helped Damien navigate the first brutal months of leadership, who had sat across from him at Sunday dinners and poured his wine and told him stories about his father as a boy. The man who ran the DeLuca family's legitimate business operations, the hotels, the real estate, the construction companies, with a quiet efficiency that everyone admired and nobody questioned. Damien had always known Victor was capable of violence. Every DeLuca was. But this, the calculated destruction of an entire family for a percentage, this was something else. This was the kind of evil that wore a suit and smiled at you over pasta. "If you have proof," Damien said, and his voice was different now, harder, the voice he used in rooms where decisions were made and regrets were manufactured. "Why haven't you gone to the feds?" "Because the feds are compromised. 3 agents on the Montclair investigation were receiving payments from accounts linked to your uncle. I have the transfer records. I have the routing numbers. I have the names." Elena leaned forward. "I didn't spend 14 years building a case to hand it to people who were paid to bury it. So what's your play? Public exposure, every piece of evidence broadcast where it can't be deleted, can't be buried, can't be negotiated away. I need a platform big enough that silencing me afterward won't matter because the information will already be everywhere." Marco spoke for the first time in 10 minutes. "And you think we're going to help you?" He was watching the road, but his voice was aimed at Elena like a weapon. "You just told us our uncle murdered your family, and you think we're going to, what, join your crusade?" "I think Damien is smart enough to understand what happens when Victor's secrets come out, whether he cooperates or not." "That sounds like a threat." "It's arithmetic. Victor destroyed my family. He helped murder Damien's father. Yes, I have evidence of that too. The hit in Newark wasn't ordered by the Calabrese family. It was ordered by Victor and executed by men on his private payroll. Your father died because he was getting too close to discovering what Victor had done with the Montclair assets." Elena's eyes found Damien's in the dark. "Your uncle killed your father, Damien, and you promoted him." The SUV swerved slightly. Marco's hands had tightened on the wheel involuntarily, and the vehicle drifted toward the center line before he corrected. In the rearview mirror, his eyes were wide. Not with disbelief, and with the sick, spiraling vertigo of a man watching the ground he's standing on crack open. Damien didn't move, didn't blink. His body had gone completely still in that way that animals go still when they sense a predator. Not frozen with fear, but coiled, every muscle locked in place by a brain that was processing information too fast for the body to keep up. His father, shot 3 times in a parking garage in Newark, January. Snow on the ground, blood steaming in the cold. Damien had been 24. He'd gotten the call at 2 a.m. and driven to the scene and stood over his father's body and made a promise that he would find every man responsible and make them understand what it cost to take something from a DeLuca. He'd found 3 men, 3 shooters. He'd made them disappear. But he'd never found the man who gave the order. He'd spent 5 years hunting a ghost, and the ghost had been sitting across from him at Sunday dinner the entire time, cutting his steak, pouring his wine, calling him nephew. "Pull over," Damien said. Marco pulled over. They were on a dead stretch of road near the Gowanus Canal, where the streetlights were broken and the water smelled like chemicals and regret. Damien opened his door, stepped out, and walked 10 feet to the edge of the canal. He stood there with his back to the car, his hands in his pockets, his shoulders rising and falling with breaths that were deeper than normal, slower than normal, the breaths of a man who was holding himself together with nothing but practice. Marco got out and leaned against the hood. Elena stayed in the back seat watching through the window. "You believe her?" Marco asked. Quiet, just between them. Damien didn't answer for a long time. A barge moved slowly down the canal, its navigation lights cutting weak lines through the black water. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and stopped, like even the animals knew this wasn't a neighborhood for making noise. "My father's security detail that night," Damien finally said. 3 men. Victor reassigned 2 of them earlier that day, said he needed them for a cargo shipment in Elizabeth. I never questioned it. That could be coincidence. Since when do you believe in coincidence? Marco exhaled, rubbed his face with both hands. If this is real, if Victor did what she says, then half the organization is his. The hotels, the construction arm, the political connections. We pull this thread, we don't just lose Victor, we lose infrastructure. I know. And the families, the Calabrese, the Moretti, the rest. If they were part of the Montclair deal, they'll come for us the second they think we're a threat. We'll be fighting on every front. I know. So what are we doing? Damien turned away from the canal. His face was different now. The carefully maintained mask of controlled indifference, the one he'd worn since he was 24, the one that had kept him alive and feared and untouchable, had cracked. Not broken. Cracked. And through the cracks, something older was visible, something that looked like a boy standing over his father's body in the snow, making a promise he didn't know how to keep. We're going back to the safe house, Damien said, and we're going to look at every piece of evidence she has. And if it's real, if she can prove what she's saying, then we're going to burn it all down. Marco stared at him. Everything? Everything Victor built, everything he touched, every alliance, every account, every handshake sealed with my family's blood. Damien's voice was low, steady, and completely devoid of the theatrical menace that most men in his position would have used. This wasn't performance. This was decision. My father built the DeLuca empire. His brother hollowed it out from the inside and filled it with rot. Whatever's left after we cut the rot out, that's what we keep. And if there's nothing left, then there was nothing worth keeping. They got back in the car. Nobody spoke for the next 20 minutes. Marco drove. Elena stared out the window. Damien sat in the dark and felt the architecture of his entire life rearrange itself around a single, unbearable fact. The man he'd trusted most had killed the man he'd loved most, and he'd spent 5 years protecting the murderer because he'd been too blind, too loyal, too much his father's son to see what was right in front of him. The safe house on Atlantic Avenue was a brownstone that looked abandoned from the outside. Boarded windows, crumbling stoop, a mailbox overflowing with junk that nobody ever collected because the junk was part of the cover. Inside it was clean, sparse, functional. A kitchen with canned food and bottled water. A living room with surveillance monitors showing feeds from cameras mounted on the surrounding buildings. 2 bedrooms with bare mattresses. A basement full of things that didn't officially exist. Elena spread her evidence across the kitchen table like a surgeon laying out instruments. Manila folders, USB drives. Photographs printed on matte paper, slightly curled at the edges from years of storage. Bank statements with entries highlighted in yellow. Phone records organized by date. A leather journal with a cracked spine that she handled with the care of someone touching a wound that hadn't healed. This is my father's personal ledger, she said. He kept a record of every transaction, legitimate and otherwise, going back 20 years. Names, dates, amounts, account numbers. When I escaped the fire, this was the only thing I took. Damien picked it up. The leather was soft, worn by years of handling. The handwriting inside was small, precise. The penmanship of a man who understood that details were the difference between power and prison. He turned pages, scanning entries, watching the numbers grow larger, watching the names repeat. Calabrese, Moretti, Ashby, and there, on a page dated 14 years ago, written in ink that had faded but not disappeared, Victor DeLuca, $14.2 million, redistribution fee, Montclair dissolution. Damien closed the ledger, set it down, pressed both palms flat on the table. The recordings you mentioned at dinner, he said, the ones about Ashby, where did those come from? Commissioner Partridge came to me 18 months ago. He'd heard rumors that I was alive. I don't know how, and I don't care. He was carrying guilt like a tumor. He'd done things for Ashby that kept him awake at night, and he wanted absolution from someone, anyone. I wasn't going to give him absolution, but I took his testimony and his recordings, and I added them to the pile. Who else knows you're alive? Before tonight, 3 people. Martin Hale, who died of cancer 6 years ago. His sister, who has Alzheimer's and lives in a facility in Lancaster. And Philip Crane. Lucia Moretti's attorney. My father's attorney first. Philip handled the Montclair estate before it was seized. He recognized me the moment he saw me at the Monarch Grand 4 years ago. He's the one who gave me the job at your hotel. He thought I'd be safe there. A ghost of something, not humor, something more bitter, crossed her face. He was wrong. Marco leaned against the kitchen doorway, arms folded, watching Elena with the expression of a man who wanted to trust what he was hearing but couldn't afford to. 4 years. You worked in that hotel for 4 years, cleaning rooms, changing sheets, scrubbing floors. Why? Because your hotel is where your uncle does business. The Monarch Grand isn't just a hotel, it's a front. Victor runs half his operation out of the penthouse suites. Guest lists, meeting schedules, phone calls, documents left in room safes with default codes nobody bothered to change. Elena pulled a USB drive from the pile and held it up. 4 years of surveillance. Audio recordings from rooms I cleaned with microphones I planted. Photographs of documents I copied before replacing them. Financial records I pulled from laptops left open on desks by men who never thought the maid was worth noticing. She set the drive down on the table. It was small, black plastic, scuffed, the kind you could buy at any pharmacy for $10. But the data on it was worth more than every bottle in the Ashworth wine cellar combined, and everyone in the room knew it. Damien looked at Elena for a long moment. His eyes moved across her face the way they moved across balance sheets, searching for the flaw, the hidden number, the entry that didn't add up. You could have gone to the press, he said. You could have dumped all of this on the internet and disappeared. Why the performance tonight? Why the dress, the speech, the confrontation with Ashby? You showed your hand in front of every family on the East Coast. Because I needed to know who would panic. Damien went still. What? Information is only valuable if you know how to aim it. I have evidence against dozens of people. Some of them are guilty. Some of them are complicit. Some of them were coerced. I needed to walk into that room and watch their faces when they realized who I was and what I knew. I needed to see who sweated, who made phone calls, who sent gunmen. She looked toward the boarded window. Now I know. You used yourself as bait. I used the gala as a diagnostic. Marco pushed off the doorway. She walked into a room full of people who wanted her dead and poked every single one of them just to see who'd flinch. And now those people have sent hit squads. And we're sitting in a safe house that isn't going to be safe for long because every family in the city is going to be looking for her by morning. He looked at Damien. Boss, this is suicide. It's leverage. It's a death sentence with extra steps. Damien's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. His expression didn't change, but the color drained from his face the way light drains from a room when the sun goes behind a cloud. Slowly, then all at once. What? Marco said. Damien turned the phone so Marco could see the screen. A text message from a number with no caller ID, 6 words. I know where you are. Marco's hand went to his gun. Elena stood from the table, her eyes suddenly hard, her body coiling with the tension of an animal that has heard the snap of a branch in quiet woods. He's tracking us, Marco said. He has to be. The SUV. It's registered to the family fleet. GPS is built in. Kill it. Marco grabbed the keys from the counter and went outside. Through the boarded window, they heard the SUV's hood open, then the sound of wires being pulled. Quick, rough, the sound of a man who had disabled tracking devices before and didn't need instructions. Elena was already packing the evidence back into her bag. Her movements were fast but precise, each folder and drive placed in order, nothing left behind, the habits of someone who had lived for years knowing that she might need to run at any moment. Damien. She said his name like it meant something, not with affection, with urgency. Victor sent the shooters tonight. He recognized me. He must have been watching the guest list, or someone at the hotel told him I'd accepted your invitation. He knows what I have, and he knows what it means for him. He won't send another team. He'll come himself. You don't know that. I know your uncle. I've studied him the way you study a disease you're trying to survive. Victor doesn't delegate when it's personal. And this is personal. This is the one secret that can destroy everything he's built. He'll come, and he'll bring people inside your organization who answer to him, not to you, people you trust. Damien's jaw tightened. How many? I don't know, but I know it's more than you think. Your uncle has been building his own network inside your family for years. Quiet, patient, placing people in positions where they can watch and report, and when the time comes, act. You think you run the DeLuca empire, Damien. She zipped the bag and slung it over her shoulder. But your uncle has been running it through you since the day your father died. The words hit him like a physical blow. Not sharp, but deep. The kind that resonates through bone and settles in the places where certainty used to live. He wanted to argue. Wanted to list the decisions he'd made, the enemies he'd crushed, the territory he'd held. But the evidence was on the table, and the text was on his phone, and the gunmen at the gala had known things that only insiders could know, and the architecture of his denial was crumbling faster than he could rebuild it. Marco came back inside. His hands were greasy, his face grim. GPS is dead. But if he already has our location, we need to move. Now. Where? Damien asked, and the fact that he was asking that Damien DeLuca, the man who always knew the next move, the man who never asked for directions because directions implied uncertainty, told Marco everything he needed to know about how far the ground had shifted tonight. Elena answered, I have a place, off the grid, no connection to any name Victor would know. She moved toward the back door, then stopped, turned, looked at Damien with an expression that was part challenge, part invitation, part warning. But once we go there, you're with me, not beside me, with me. That means when the time comes to take your uncle down, you don't hesitate, you don't negotiate, you don't try to save the family name or protect the empire or find some middle ground that lets everyone walk away with their dignity. There is no middle ground. Victor killed your father, he killed mine. And if we don't stop him, he'll kill us both and rewrite the story so that nobody ever knows the truth. She opened the back door. Cold air flooded in, carrying the smell of salt water and rust from the canal. Outside, Brooklyn was dark and indifferent, a city that had witnessed 1,000 betrayals and never lost sleep over any of them. Damien stood in the kitchen of his own safe house, surrounded by surveillance monitors that showed empty streets, and felt the last tether to his old life stretched to its breaking point. Behind him was everything he knew. The organization, the name, the power, the careful architecture of fear and loyalty that had kept him alive for 5 years. Ahead of him was a woman he'd met as a maid, a bag full of evidence that could burn his world to ash, and a fight against the one man he'd never suspected and never prepared for. Marco was watching him, waiting, the way he always waited, one step below, loyal to a fault, ready to follow whatever decision Damien made, even if it led them both off a cliff. Damien looked at the phone in his hand. Victor's message glowed on the screen like a lit fuse. He dropped the phone on the kitchen counter, walked toward the door, and stepped through it into the cold November dark without looking back. There was no going back. There had never been a going back, he realized, not since the moment Elena Vale had walked into his ballroom in a silver gown and turned his entire world into a lie. The only direction left was forward, into the fire, and the fire was already burning. They drove for 40 minutes through parts of Brooklyn that didn't exist on tourist maps. Streets where the pavement cracked like dried skin, where bodegas operated behind bulletproof glass, where the only people awake at 1 a.m. were the ones who had reasons not to sleep. Elena directed Marco from the back seat and clipped precise instructions. Left here, right at the warehouse, straight past the overpass. Stop. The building was a converted textile factory in Sunset Park, 5 stories of red brick and boarded windows wedged between a scrapyard and a shuttered fish processing plant. The kind of place that smelled like rust and ammonia and abandonment. Elena led them through a service entrance on the ground floor, past rows of silent industrial sewing machines still bolted to the concrete, up a freight elevator that groaned like it resented the interruption. The 4th floor had been transformed, not luxuriously, functionally. A single open space divided by cheap partition walls into zones. A sleeping area with a military cot and a wool blanket folded with hospital corners. A kitchen consisting of a hot plate, a mini fridge, and a shelf of canned food organized by expiration date. And in the center of the room, occupying more space than everything else combined, a workspace that made Damien stop in the doorway. 3 folding tables pushed together, covered in documents. A corkboard mounted on the wall behind them, 8 feet wide, pinned with photographs, newspaper clippings, red string connecting faces to names to dates to dollar amounts. Monitors, 4 of them, sat on a metal desk in the corner, their screens dark but their hard drives humming, green power lights blinking like patient eyes. Filing cabinets lined the far wall, each drawer labeled with a surname: Calabrese Moretti, Ashby, DeLuca. And at the top, in larger letters on a cabinet that stood apart from the rest, Montclair. Damien walked to the corkboard. He didn't touch it. He studied it the way a man studies his own autopsy report, with horror, fascination, and the growing certainty that he's looking at something that cannot be unseen. The photographs were surveillance shots, taken from distance, grainy but clear enough. Victor DeLuca entering a brownstone in the Bronx. Victor shaking hands with a man Damien didn't recognize outside a restaurant in Little Italy. Victor sitting in the back of a town car with Senator Ashby, both of them laughing about something that Damien now understood was probably the profitable murder of an entire family. Red string connected Victor's photograph to 11 others. 11. Not 3. Not 5. 11 people inside the DeLuca organization who were linked by evidence pinned to this board directly to Victor's private operations. 11, Damien said. His voice sounded like it was coming from somewhere outside his body. That I can confirm. Elena set her bag on the table and began unloading the materials she'd taken from the safe house. There may be more. Your uncle is careful. He doesn't recruit people. He cultivates them. Finds their weaknesses, their debts, their secrets. Creates dependency first, loyalty second. By the time they're his, they don't even realize the transition happened. Damien found a face on the board he recognized. Tommy Ricci, his driver. The man who picked him up every morning, who knew his schedule, his routes, his habits. Tommy's photograph was connected to Victor's by a single red line with a notation beneath it: $8,000 per month. Direct deposit. Cayman routing. His driver. The man who drove him to meetings, to dinners, to the cemetery where his father was buried. Damien pressed his thumb and forefinger against the bridge of his nose and squeezed until his sinuses ached. It was the only thing he could do with his hands that wasn't violent. Marco was studying the board too, and the expression on his face was one Damien had never seen before. A kind of sick fascination, the look of a man watching his own house being dismantled beam by beam. Marco's name was not on the board. That fact hung in the air between them, unspoken, significant. I need to verify this, Marco said. His voice was hoarse, as if he'd been screaming, though he hadn't raised it above a whisper since they left the canal. Names on a board and string don't mean anything. We need confirmation. Elena opened her laptop, a battered ThinkPad covered in stickers that had been half peeled off, and typed a password that took her 15 seconds to enter. The screens on the metal desk flickered to life. Each one displayed a different feed: financial transaction logs, phone metadata charts, a map of the city overlaid with movement patterns tracked by cell tower data. Pick a name, she said. Marco stepped closer. His finger hovered over the board, then landed on a photograph of a heavy-set man with a shaved head and a scar bisecting his left eyebrow. Sal Benedito. He runs our warehouse operations in Red Hook. He's been with the family since before Damien's father, Elena typed. The leftmost monitor filled with data, bank statements, call logs, a timeline of transactions stretching back 7 years. She scrolled to a highlighted entry. Sal Benedetto received 3 payments of $40,000 each from an account registered to Greystone Holdings, LLC. Greystone is a shell company incorporated in Delaware, managed by a registered agent in Wilmington who also manages 14 other shells, all of which trace back to a single beneficial owner. She clicked. A corporate structure diagram appeared, lines branching and converging like a nervous system. At the top, circled in red, Victor DeLuca. 3 payments, Elena continued. The first was 6 months before Damien's father was killed. The second was 1 week after. The third was 1 month later. I believe the first was the recruitment payment. The second was confirmation of cooperation. The third was silence. Marco's face had gone the color of wet cement. He turned to Damien. Sal ran the security logistics for your father's Newark meeting. He was the one who confirmed the location was clean. Damien didn't respond. He was staring at the screen, at the numbers and dates and routing codes that were systematically demolishing every assumption he'd made about the men who surrounded him. He thought about Sal. Big, loud, always laughing, always the first to raise a glass at family gatherings, always calling Damien kid in that rough, affectionate way that made it feel like he was part of something real. Sal, who had hugged him at his father's funeral and said, with tears in his eyes, that he would do anything to find the men responsible. Sal, who had already been paid. "How long have you had this?" Damien asked Elena. Not angry, hollow. The voice of a man standing in the wreckage of something he built on a foundation he now understood was sand. "I started building the financial picture 7 years ago. The surveillance into the hotel gave me the operational details. The recordings, the documents, the schedules, those came in over the last 4 years. The Montclair ledger connected everything." 7 years. Damien turned from the screen. "You were, what, 21 when you started?" "I was 21 when I stopped running and started fighting. Everything before that was survival." Elena pulled a chair from the table and sat. For the first time since the gala, her composure cracked. Just slightly, just enough to show the exhaustion underneath. She rubbed her temples with her fingertips, pressing hard, the kind of pressure that says the headache has been there for hours and isn't going away. "I spent 3 years in Pennsylvania. 2 in a group home when Martin's sister couldn't take care of me anymore. 1 working at a diner in Allentown. Then I came back to the city because running was making me someone I didn't want to be. And Philip Crane helped you. Philip got me the job, got me the identity. Elena Vale, social security number, work history, rental history, everything fabricated by a man who spent 40 years making paper trails for people who didn't want to be found." She looked at Damien, and in the flat light of the monitors, her face held something he hadn't seen there before. Weariness. The deep, bone-level kind that sleep doesn't fix, because it isn't caused by lack of rest, but by the sustained effort of being someone you're not, year after year, in rooms full of people who would kill you if they knew the truth. Marco paced near the window. His hand kept moving to his phone, then away, then back. The compulsive gesture of a man who wanted to call someone and was terrified of who might answer. "We need to know who's still loyal, right now, tonight. If half the organization is compromised," "It's not half," Elena said. "It's key positions. Victor is surgical. He doesn't need numbers. He needs leverage points. The driver, the warehouse chief, the accountant, the guys who control information flow. 11 people in the right seats can puppet an entire organization without anyone knowing. Then we identify them and cut them out." "It's not that simple." Elena pulled up another screen. 3 of the 11 are in Damien's inner security detail. 1 of them is currently assigned to protect Damien's sister. The room stopped. Damien's head turned slowly, the way a gun turret turns. Mechanical, deliberate, loaded. "What did you say?" "Your sister, Isabella. She has a protective detail of 4 men. One of them, a man named Paul Corsetti, has been receiving payments from Victor's network for 2 years. My sister is in Connecticut. She's out of the business. She has nothing to do with any of this. She's your uncle's insurance policy." Elena's voice was flat, clinical, the way an emergency room doctor sounds when delivering a diagnosis that changes everything. "As long as one of his people is standing next to her, Victor has leverage over you. He can make a phone call and your sister becomes a hostage, a victim, or a bargaining chip. That's why Corsetti is there. Not to protect her, to hold her." Damien's hand was on the table, and his fingers were pressing into the surface so hard that the tips had gone white. His breathing had changed, shallow, rapid, the breathing of a man whose body is preparing for something his mind hasn't authorized yet. Isabella, 26 years old. The one good thing left in a family that had been rotting from the inside for longer than he'd known. She'd left the city 3 years ago. His decision, his insistence, because he'd wanted her away from the violence, away from the politics, away from the endless parade of men in expensive suits making ugly decisions. He'd sent her to a house in Greenwich with a garden and a view of the Sound and 4 men he trusted to keep her safe. One of those men belonged to Victor. Damien pulled out his phone. Not the one he'd left at the safe house, a backup he kept in his inside jacket pocket, a number known only to 6 people. He dialed Isabella's number. It rang once, twice, 3 times, 4, Voicemail. He dialed again. Same result. Marco? Marco was already moving, pulling his own phone. He called the head of Isabella's detail, Frank Russo, a man who'd been with the DeLucas for 12 years. The phone rang 6 times and went to voicemail. He tried Corsetti's number next. Voicemail. The third man on the detail, Nick Andrade. Voicemail. Nobody's picking up, Marco said. His voice had crossed the line from controlled to something that lived next to panic. Call the house, Damien said. The landline. Marco called. The line connected. A recording played. The number you have reached is no longer in service. The line had been disconnected. Damien looked at Elena. His eyes were different now. The calculated coldness was gone. What replaced it was older, rawer, something that had been buried under years of strategy and discipline and the careful performance of a man who couldn't afford to feel things fully. It was fear. Real, uncut animal fear. The kind that comes when you realize the threat isn't abstract, isn't theoretical, isn't a line item on a board full of red string. The threat is breathing the same air as someone you love, and you can't reach them. When did Corsetti start on her detail? Damien asked. 2 years ago. You assigned him yourself on Victor's recommendation. The words were a knife, and she twisted it without cruelty, without satisfaction. Just the clean surgical precision of a woman who understood that the truth was more devastating than any weapon, and that delivering it gently didn't make it hurt less. Damien grabbed his jacket from the back of a chair. We're going to Connecticut. If Victor has moved on, Isabella, driving to Connecticut is exactly what he wants you to do. You'll be on the road, exposed, running toward a trap with no backup and no plan. She's my sister. And you're the only person alive who can bring Victor down. If you die on the Merritt Parkway tonight, everything, all of this, dies with you. Your father's murder stays unsolved. My parents' murder stays unpunished. And Victor DeLuca inherits everything, clean and free, with nobody left to contradict his version of history. Damien slammed his palm against the table. The monitor shuddered. A coffee mug on the edge tipped and shattered on the concrete floor, the pieces skittering into the dark corners of the room like insects fleeing light. Don't talk to me about strategy. That's my sister. She's not a chess piece. She's not a line item on your goddamn corkboard. She's the only family I have left that hasn't been bought, corrupted, or killed. And if something happens to her because I was sitting in a warehouse looking at spreadsheets, then we need to be smart about this. Elena stood. She walked to him, close, closer than she'd been all night, close enough that he could see the fine tremor in her hands that she'd been hiding all evening. She was afraid too. She just wore it differently. I spent 14 years being smart about things that made me want to scream. I know what it costs. I know what it takes from you. But running into a trap doesn't save Isabella. It gives Victor exactly what he needs. You, isolated, emotional, making decisions with your gut instead of your head. Damien's chest was heaving. His eyes were wet. Not crying, not yet. But the pressure was there, building behind a dam that had been holding for 5 years and was cracking now, in this warehouse, in front of a woman he'd known for less than 8 hours, and a best friend who was watching him with the expression of a man who was witnessing something he'd never seen before. Damien DeLuca. Afraid. Damien DeLuca. Helpless. Damien DeLuca. Human. Then what do we do? He said, and the question came out broken, the edges rough, the voice of a man asking for help for the first time in his adult life. Elena turned to Marco. You have people you trust. Truly trust. Not from the organization, from before, from the streets. Marco nodded slowly. A few. Call them, not from your phone. Use mine. She pulled a burner from a drawer, one of several, Damien noticed, lined up like ammunition. Send them to the house in Greenwich, surveillance only. No contact, no approach, just eyes on the property. We need to know if Isabella is still there, if Corsetti has made a move, if Victor has sent additional men. Marco took the phone. His hands were steady now, not because he wasn't afraid, but because he had a task, and tasks were easier than feelings. He dialed from memory, speaking low, giving coordinates and instructions with the efficiency of a man who had coordinated operations in the dark before. Damien stood at the window. The glass was filthy, streaked with years of grime, And through it, Sunset Park sprawled below in a grid of dim streetlights and dark buildings. He pressed his forehead against the glass. It was cold. The cold felt honest. Everything else in his life was proving to be a lie. His family, his organization, his uncle, his security, the foundation he'd built his identity on. But cold glass against skin was simple and real and couldn't betray you. His phone buzzed. The backup phone. The one with the number known only to 6 people. He looked at the screen. A text from an unknown number. A photograph. Isabella. Sitting in what looked like the living room of the Greenwich house. The familiar bay window behind her, the sound visible through the glass. She was sitting on the couch, fully dressed, her face pale but composed. She didn't look injured. She looked like a woman who understood with terrible clarity that her life was being used as currency. She was holding a newspaper. Today's edition of the New York Post. Proof of life, dated. Below the photograph, a message. She's comfortable. For now. Let's have a conversation, nephew. Damien's hand closed around the phone until the case cracked. A sound came out of him. Not a word, not a scream, something lower and more animal than either. The sound a man makes when the last thing he was protecting is pulled beyond his reach. Marco was beside him in 3 steps. He saw the photo. His face went blank. The total blankness of a combat veteran who has just heard the order that tells him everything is about to get worse. He moved fast. He was already in position. Elena was behind them, reading the screen over Damien's shoulder. Her voice was quiet, stripped of the clinical detachment she'd maintained all night. What replaced it was something that Damien, in his current state of fractured awareness, recognized as grief. Not for herself. For him. Victor planned for this. The gala, the shooters, Isabella, it's all one operation. He knew that if his cover was blown, his only leverage was her. He had Corsetti in place for 2 years waiting for exactly this scenario. 2 years. Damien's voice was a whisper. He's been planning to use my sister against me for 2 years. Longer. He's been planning to replace you since the day your father died. You were useful, young, loyal, too focused on hunting the men who pulled the trigger to notice the man who gave the order. But Victor always knew there was an expiration date. Eventually you'd grow. You'd start asking questions. You'd notice the discrepancies. Or someone would walk into your ballroom and start exposing secrets. She paused. I forced his timeline. He wasn't ready for tonight, but he had contingencies, and Isabella was the biggest one. Damien set the phone down on the table. Slowly, carefully, the way you set down something fragile. Then he turned to Elena and looked at her with eyes that had been emptied of everything except one thing, a cold, clear, terrifying resolve that made the air in the room feel thin. Your plan, the public exposure, the broadcast, when were you going to do it? The charity auction, the Albright Foundation Gala, 2 weeks from now, every major player will be there. Political figures, financial executives, crime family representatives. It's the only event with enough visibility and enough targets in one room. 2 weeks. I know we don't have 2 weeks. Victor has my sister. Every hour we wait is an hour he has to move her, hurt her, or use her to force me into something I can't take back. Damien's jaw clenched so hard the muscles in his neck stood out like cables. We move the timeline up. That's impossible. The logistics alone, you've had 14 years to prepare. You have the evidence, you have the recordings, you have the financial records and the testimony and the ledger and 4 years of surveillance from my own hotel. The only thing you don't have is a venue and a trigger. I'll give you both. Elena stared at him. She'd spent over a decade imagining this moment, the moment when all the pieces would converge, when the patient, agonizing work of building a case from the shadows would finally have its day. She'd imagined it as a solo act. Her evidence, her plan, her revenge. She hadn't imagined sharing it with a man whose family name was on one of her filing cabinets, a man whose uncle had signed the order that orphaned her. But the world doesn't care about your imagined scenarios. It gives you what it gives you, and you adapt or you break. What are you proposing? She asked. The auction is in 2 weeks, but the setup begins earlier. The venue, Schatz, the Grand Meridian Hotel on 5th Avenue, Starts preparation 4 days before the event. AV equipment, staging, security protocols, all coordinated through an event management firm that the DeLuca family has used for 15 years. A firm that answers to me, not to Victor. Elena's eyes narrowed. The calculator behind them was running, processing implications, weighing risks. You want to rig the venue. I want to turn every screen, every speaker, every broadcast link in that building into a delivery system for your evidence. When the room is full, when every senator, every judge, every family boss, every banker who profited from your parents' murder is holding a champagne glass and smiling for the cameras, we hit them. All of it, everything you have, simultaneously, on every screen, streamed to every news outlet and every law enforcement agency that hasn't been bought. And Isabella? Damien's face changed again. The resolve was still there, but underneath it, visible only if you knew what to look for, was the raw and ragged edge of a man being torn in two directions by forces that couldn't both be satisfied. Save his sister or destroy his uncle. Protect the one person he loved or avenge everyone he'd lost. The math was impossible. The choice was inhuman, and he had to make it. Before the broadcast, he said, we get her out. I need 3 days. 3 days to locate exactly where she's being held, build an extraction plan, and execute it before Victor knows we've moved. He looked at Marco. Can you do it? Marco held his gaze. Something passed between them. Not words, not even a specific understanding, but the deep, inarticulate bond of two men who had been through enough together that language was a formality. Marco nodded once. I need bodies, real ones, people who don't exist in Victor's network. Elena's contacts? Elena shook her head. I don't have operational people. I have information sources. Attorneys, accountants, one retired police detective. Nobody who can run an extraction. Damien ran his hand over his jaw. The stubble rasped against his palm. He was thinking about a name he hadn't spoken in 3 years. A name attached to a man he'd cut ties with after a disagreement that had nearly turned fatal. A man who owed him nothing and had every reason to refuse. But a man who had the skills, the crew, and the kind of moral flexibility that this situation demanded. Nikos Kazan, Damien said. Marco's head snapped up. No. He's the only one with a team that Victor doesn't know about. Nikos Kazan tried to kill you in 2023. You put 2 of his men in the hospital. He swore on his mother's name he'd put you in the ground. Then I'll have to make him a better offer than revenge. Damien picked up Elena's burner phone, turned it over in his hand, and looked at it the way a man looks at a loaded weapon he's not sure he should pick up. Everyone has a price, even Nikos. Marco opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. Because there was nothing to argue. They were 3 people in an abandoned factory with a bag of evidence, a wall of red string, and a borrowed phone, facing a man who controlled half the criminal infrastructure of the eastern seaboard and was currently holding a hostage. They didn't have the luxury of safe choices. They only had choices, and all of them were terrible, and the only thing worse than making one was making none. Damien dialed. The phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times, 4. On the 5th ring, a voice answered, deep, accented, thick with sleep and suspicion. Who is this? It's Damien DeLuca. Silence. A long, dangerous silence. The kind that precedes either a conversation or a gunshot. Then a laugh, low, humorless, with edges sharp enough to draw blood. DeLuca. 3 years, and you call me at 2 a.m. Either you're dying or you need something you can't get from anyone else. Which is it? Both, Damien said, and meant it. On the monitor behind him, the map of the city pulsed with data. Cell tower pings, transaction records, movement patterns. The digital skeleton of an empire built on murder and maintained by a man who was, at this very moment, sitting in a house in Greenwich beside Damien's sister, waiting with the patience of a predator who knows that the trap has already closed. The clock on the wall read 2:47 a.m. In less than 72 hours, Damien would either rescue his sister and destroy his uncle or lose everything. His family, his empire, his name, and the woman standing beside him who had survived 14 years in the dark for a chance at exactly this moment. 72 hours. And the first move belonged to a man who wanted him dead. Nikos Kazan arrived at the Sunset Park warehouse at 4 a.m. in a black sedan that smelled like cigarettes and gun oil. He came alone, which was either a sign of confidence or a sign that he'd already positioned men on the surrounding rooftops before walking in. With Nikos, both were equally likely. He was 43 years old, Greek-born, Brooklyn-raised, built like a man who had spent his 20s fighting in places that didn't make the news, and his 30s profiting from the skills those places had given him. His face was all angles, sharp cheekbones, a nose that had been broken at least twice and reset by someone who wasn't a doctor, and eyes the color of wet slate that moved across a room the way a blade moves across skin. He wore a leather jacket over a black t-shirt, no tie, no pretense. Nikos Kazan had never pretended to be anything other than what he was. And what he was had made a lot of people very nervous for a very long time. He stood in the center of Elena's workspace, hands in his pockets, scanning the corkboard, the monitors, the filing cabinets, with the unhurried attention of a man browsing a museum exhibit. Damien stood 6 feet away. Marco stood near the door, his hand resting on the butt of his gun, the way other men rest their hand on a railing, casual, automatic, just in case the floor gave out. 3 years, Nikos said. He didn't look at Damien when he spoke. He was studying a photograph of Victor DeLuca on the corkboard, tracing the red strings with his eyes. Last time we talked, you told me I'd never work in this city again. Said you'd bury me so deep they'd need a mining permit to find my body. I remember. And now you need me. Nikos turned. His smile was thin and sharp, the kind that has nothing to do with happiness. Must be killing you. I'm not here to reminisce. I'm here to make a deal. Nikos glanced at Elena, who was sitting at the monitor desk with her arms crossed, watching him with the same expression she'd worn all night. Controlled, evaluative, patient. Who's she? The reason we're all in this room. That doesn't answer my question. It's the only answer you're getting tonight. Damien stepped forward. Not aggressively, deliberately, closing the distance between them because distance was a luxury and he was out of those. My uncle has my sister. She's being held at a house in Greenwich by men who answer to him. I need her out. Alive. Before Friday. Friday? Nikos raised an eyebrow. That's 60 hours. I know the math. And what happens Friday? Something that's going to make a lot of powerful people very unhappy. Something that will, among other things, create a vacuum in the power structure of this city that a man like you could fill very comfortably. Nikos was quiet for a moment. His eyes moved from Damien to Elena, to the corkboard, to the monitors, and back to Damien. The calculator behind those wet slate eyes was running, and Damien could almost hear it, the click of variables being assigned values, risks being weighed, outcomes being projected. The DeLuca Empire falls, Nikos said. Not a question. A statement. That's what's happening Friday. Parts of it. The parts your uncle built. The parts built on blood that wasn't supposed to be spilled. Nikos pulled a cigarette from his jacket pocket and put it between his lips without lighting it. A habit. The oral fixation of a man who had quit smoking 3 times and kept the prop because the ritual calmed him more than the nicotine ever had. I want the waterfront, he said. The Red Hook warehouses. The shipping contracts. When Victor's network collapses, those assets go to me. Done. And the restaurant on Arthur Avenue. The one your uncle uses for meetings. It's yours. And I want Marco to say please. Marco's jaw tightened. Nikos grinned. A real grin this time, wide and reckless, the grin of a man who understood that power is as much about humiliation as it is about profit. We don't have time for this, Marco said. Then I walk. Marco. Damien's voice was iron wrapped in silk. Marco looked at Damien, looked at Nikos. His nostrils flared. His Adam's apple moved. He swallowed something that tasted worse than pride. Please, Marco said. The word came out like he was spitting a tooth. Nikos pulled the unlit cigarette from his mouth and pointed it at Marco. Beautiful. I'll need blueprints of the Greenwich property, security detail profiles, and any surveillance your people have gathered in the last 12 hours. And I'll need them in 3 hours because my team doesn't operate without preparation and I don't send men into a situation blind. Marco's contacts had already delivered. Two of his street-level associates, men who didn't appear in any DeLuca database, who operated in cash and prepaid phones and the kind of anonymity that only poverty can provide, had been watching the Greenwich house since 3 a.m. Their reports came in fragments, relayed through burner phones, assembled like puzzle pieces on Elena's monitors. The house was active, lights on in the main level and the upper east bedroom, Isabella's room. 3 vehicles in the driveway, a black Lincoln Town Car, a gray Tahoe, and Corsetti's personal BMW. Movement visible through the windows. At least 4 men, possibly 5. Armed, rotating positions every 30 minutes with the discipline of a trained protection detail, which they were, except the person they were protecting was also the person they were imprisoning. No sign of Victor himself. He was somewhere else, directing, coordinating, maintaining distance the way he always did. Victor DeLuca never stood in the room where the violence happened. He stood in the room next door and listened through the wall. The next 48 hours moved in a blur of preparation that felt like drowning in slow motion. Damien didn't sleep, couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Isabella's face in the photograph, pale, composed, her eyes carrying the specific kind of stillness that comes from understanding that your life has been reduced to a negotiation. He sat at Elena's monitor desk and studied the surveillance feeds and the floor plans and the security rotations until the numbers and patterns were burned into his brain like a brand. Elena worked beside him, not next to him, beside him. The distinction mattered. She was parallel, not attached, building her own machinery for the Friday strike, with the same relentless precision she'd applied to 14 years of covert intelligence gathering. She reformatted files. She tested broadcast equipment, a compact satellite uplink device the size of a briefcase that she'd purchased 3 years ago from a man in Queens who didn't ask questions. She wrote scripts, actual scripts, word-for-word narrations that would accompany the evidence when it hit the screens, because she understood that raw data meant nothing without context, and context required a voice. On Wednesday afternoon, she caught Damien staring at her from across the room, not the way he'd looked at her at the gala. That had been curiosity, evaluation, the predatory assessment of a man encountering something he didn't understand. This was different, quieter, more dangerous. "Don't," she said. "Don't what?" "Whatever you're building in your head right now, don't." "I'm not building anything." "You're building a reason to trust me that goes beyond the evidence, and you can't afford that. Not now." She turned back to her screen, her fingers paused on the keyboard. "After Friday. After it's done. Then you can look at me like that. But right now, I need you sharp, and soft feelings make people dull." He wanted to argue. He didn't. Because she was right, and being right was more valuable than being comforting, and he was learning, slowly, painfully, that Elena Montclair Vale didn't offer comfort because she'd never had the luxury of receiving any. Thursday, 2 a.m. The extraction. Nikos brought 6 men, not soldiers, specialists, each one selected for a specific function, each one briefed to the point of redundancy, each one carrying equipment that was not available at any retail establishment. They gathered in a parking lot behind a gas station in Stamford, Connecticut, 12 miles from the Greenwich house, and went over the plan one final time under the yellow buzzing lights, while moths beat themselves against the fluorescent tubes overhead. The plan was simple because complex plans break. Nikos had said that, sitting in the warehouse on Tuesday, spreading out the blueprints on Elena's table, tapping locations with a thick finger. Complex plans are for movies. Real operations have 3 steps. Get in, get the package, get out. Everything else is improvisation. Step 1. Disable the external security. The house had cameras on all 4 corners, motion sensors along the perimeter, and a hardwired alarm system connected to a private security company that Victor had contracted specifically because they didn't ask questions. Nikos had a man for this, a former systems engineer named Petrov, who could kill an alarm network in under 90 seconds and make it look like a software glitch. Step 2. Breach. 2 entry points, the kitchen door on the south side and the basement window on the east. Simultaneous. 4 men through the kitchen, 2 through the basement. Suppressed weapons. Non-lethal first. Flashbangs, zip ties, controlled chaos. Corsetti and the other guards needed to be neutralized before they could make a phone call or reach a weapon. Step 3. Isabella. Upper East bedroom. One man assigned exclusively to her extraction, getting her out of the room, down the stairs, into the vehicle, and away from the property before anyone outside the house knew something had happened. Damien had wanted to go in. Nikos had refused. You're the principal. Principals don't breach. Principals wait in the car and count their heartbeats until the radio says clear. That's the job. Your job. She's my sister. And she'll be a lot more upset if she gets rescued and you get shot in the process. Sit in the car, DeLuca. Let me do what you're paying me for. So Damien sat in the car. A rental sedan parked on a side road a quarter-mile from the property, engine running, lights off. Marco in the driver's seat with both hands on the wheel like he was trying to strangle it. The radio on the center console crackled with static. Nikos's frequency, encrypted, short range, 2:17 a.m. Petrov's voice, barely a whisper. Cameras down, alarm down, perimeter clear. 2:18 a.m. Nikos. Breach team, go. Damien's heart was doing something it hadn't done since he was 24 years old, standing in a parking garage in Newark looking at his father's body. It was beating so hard he could feel it in his teeth. His hands were fists on his thighs. His breathing was shallow, rapid, the breathing of a man whose body wanted to run, but whose discipline forced him to sit. 30 seconds of silence, the longest 30 seconds of his life. Then sounds through the radio. A crash, a shout cut short, the dull thump of a flashbang, 2 suppressed gunshots so quiet they sounded like someone slapping a pillow. Kitchen clear, 2 down. Basement clear, 1 down. Moving to second floor. Another shout, this one louder. A voice Damien recognized. Corsetti, Paul Corsetti, the man who'd been standing next to Isabella for 2 years pretending to protect her while waiting for the order to use her as a weapon. Corsetti's voice was high, panicked, the voice of a man who had been woken from sleep by the barrel of a gun pressing against his forehead. A scuffle. Something heavy hitting the floor. Then silence. Second floor clear, package secured, she's okay. She's okay, DeLuca. Damien's breath left him in a rush that fogged the windshield. His eyes burned. He pressed his palms against them until he saw sparks, and in the darkness behind his hands, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel since the night his father died. Relief so intense it was indistinguishable from pain. 3 minutes later, a van pulled onto the side road. The rear door opened and Isabella DeLuca stepped out, or rather, was helped out, because her legs were unsteady and her hands were shaking and she was wearing a bathrobe over pajamas and no shoes. She was 26 years old and looked 40 in the moonlight, the way people look when they've spent 72 hours understanding that their life was conditional. Damien got out of the sedan. He didn't run. He walked. 1 step, then another, each one a battle against the instinct to sprint. When he reached her, he put his arms around her, and she collapsed against his chest with a sound that wasn't a sob and wasn't a scream, but something between the two. The sound a person makes when the sustained effort of being brave finally finds an exit. "I've got you," he said. His voice cracked on the second word. He didn't care. "I've got you." She pulled back, looked at his face. Her eyes, dark, like his, like their father's, searched him with the intensity of someone checking for structural damage. "Victor," she said. 1 word. "Enough." "I know." "He came to the house Monday night, sat in my living room, drank my coffee." Her voice was raw, scraped thin by days of fear and forced composure. "He told me you'd done something foolish, that you'd gotten involved with the wrong woman, that he needed to keep me safe until things settled down. He smiled the entire time, Damien, the entire time, like he was doing me a favor. It's over. He can't reach you now." "It's not over." Isabella gripped the front of his jacket. Her knuckles were white. He said something else, before he left. He said if you didn't cooperate, he'd make sure the federal investigation buried you instead of him. He said he had documents, things with your signature, your accounts, your name, that would put you in prison for the rest of your life. He said he's been building a case against you for years, and all he had to do was make 1 phone call. The words landed on Damien like a collapsing ceiling, one blow after another, each one heavier than the last. Not just the betrayal of a murder, not just the theft of a legacy. Victor had been building a trap, a legal, evidentiary, airtight trap, that would redirect every crime he'd committed into Damien's name. Every dirty transaction, every bribed official, every laundered dollar, all of it carefully documented, carefully structured, carefully designed to make it look like Damien DeLuca was the architect of everything his uncle had built. If Victor made that phone call before Friday, the federal investigation wouldn't touch him. It would destroy Damien instead. And Elena's evidence, the ledger, the recordings, the surveillance, would be dismissed as the desperate fabrications of a dead girl and a man already under indictment. Damien's phone buzzed. A call this time, not a text. Unknown number. He answered. "Hello, nephew." Victor DeLuca's voice was warm, avuncular. The voice of Sunday dinners and birthday presents and a hand on your shoulder telling you everything would be all right. The voice of the man who had ordered his brother's murder and was now calling from whatever shadow he'd retreated to, confident and calm, because Victor was always confident and always calm. That was his genius. That was his horror. "You took her," Damien said. "I kept her safe. The way I've always kept this family safe. The way I kept you safe after your father's unfortunate departure." A pause. The sound of ice clinking in a glass. Victor drinking something expensive while discussing the kidnapping of his niece. "I see you've retrieved her. That's fine. She was never the point, Damien. She was the conversation starter. What do you want? I want you to come home, to remember who you are and where you come from. To stop playing vigilante with a dead man's daughter, and understand that the empire your father built, the empire I maintained, I strengthened, I protected while you were busy playing detective, belongs to this family, not to some ghost with a grudge." Damien's grip on the phone was so tight the plastic creaked. "You killed my father." Silence. 3 seconds. 4. Then Victor sighed. Actually sighed, the way a parent sighs at a child who has made a disappointing choice. "Your father was a good man, but good men don't survive in this world. He was going to dismantle the Montclair arrangement. He was going to expose the redistribution, return the assets, destroy alliances that had taken a decade to build. He was going to burn everything for the sake of a principle that nobody else in this business shares. I gave him the chance to reconsider. He refused. So I did what the family needed me to do." Damien heard it all. Heard the justification, the casual logic of fratricide wrapped in the language of pragmatism. And he felt something close in his chest, not anger, not grief, something beyond both. A door shutting. The final door. The one behind which the possibility of redemption, of explanation, of any version of Victor that wasn't a monster had been hiding. That door was closed now, and locked, and the key had been swallowed. "The federal documents," Damien said. "The ones with my name." "Ah, Isabella told you." Another clink of ice. "Yes, comprehensive, convincing. They've been in preparation for 3 years. Everything traces to you, the accounts, the transactions, the political contributions. If I make one call, the Southern District of New York opens an investigation that will consume you. Your assets freeze, your accounts are seized, your passport is flagged, and everything that girl thinks she has, her father's ledger, her little recordings, her surveillance footage, becomes the ravings of a defendant's accomplice. You'd destroy me to protect yourself. I do what I've always done, protect the family. You are not the family. You're the thing that's been eating it from the inside." Victor laughed, soft, brief, genuinely amused. "Friday night, the Albright Gala. I know what you're planning. Did you think I wouldn't? I built the infrastructure you're trying to weaponize. I know every event manager, every AV technician, every security contractor. Whatever broadcast you're planning, it won't happen. My people will be inside that building before your people finish parking the van." Damien looked at Elena. She was standing beside the sedan, listening, her face illuminated by the glow of the dashboard lights through the open door. She'd heard everything. Her expression was stone, absolute, impenetrable, the face of a woman who had been outmaneuvered before and knew that the worst moment of any chess game is when your opponent tells you they can see the board too. You have until tomorrow morning, Victor said. Walk away, take Isabella, leave the city. I'll let the federal documents gather dust, and you can live a quiet life somewhere warm with a woman who isn't worth dying for. Or don't walk away. Come to the gala, try your little broadcast. And I will end you, legally, publicly, and permanently. The DeLuca name will survive. It just won't be your DeLuca name anymore. The line went dead. Damien lowered the phone. His arm felt heavy, as if the device weighed 100 pounds. Around him, the Connecticut night was still and cold. The kind of cold that gets into your joints and makes everything ache. Isabella was in the van with Marco, wrapped in a blanket, being driven to a secondary safe house that Nikos had arranged in New Haven. Nikos's men were loading equipment, moving with the quiet efficiency of professionals who understood that standing still after an operation was the fastest way to get caught. Elena walked toward him. She stopped 3 feet away. That distance again. Their distance. Close enough to speak, far enough to think. He knows about Friday, she said. He knows about the venue. He doesn't know what we have. He doesn't need to know what we have. If his people control the building, our evidence never reaches a screen. Damien looked at her. The moonlight caught the edge of her jaw, the line of her throat, the tension in her shoulders that she carried the way Atlas carried the sky. Not because she chose to, but because there was nobody else. He thought about what Victor had said. A woman who isn't worth dying for. And he thought about his father, who had died for a principle that nobody else in this business shares, and he wondered if principles and people were really so different, or if the willingness to die for either one was the only thing that separated the men who mattered from the men who didn't. We changed the venue, Damien said. Elena's eyes narrowed. To where? Victor's territory. Not the Albright Gala, the Monarch Grand Hotel. Your hotel. His hotel. The building he's been using as his operational headquarters for 15 years. The building you spent 4 years surveilling. The building whose AV systems, security networks, and broadcast infrastructure you know better than anyone alive because you planted devices in every room that matters. Elena's lips parted, not in surprise. In recognition, the slow, almost physical click of a strategy shifting its axis. The charity auction is public, Damien continued. Guest list, media coverage, live stream. Victor will be expecting us at the Albright. He'll have every man he owns inside that building, watching every screen, guarding every entrance. Meanwhile, the Monarch Grand will be hosting its own event Friday night, the annual New York Financial Leadership Summit. 300 guests, bankers, regulators, media, political donors. Every screen in the ballroom wired to a central AV system that routes through a server room on the 3rd floor. A server room I've been inside 200 times. While changing the sheets. Elena stared at him. Something shifted in her face. Not warmth, not yet, but the absence of coldness. A thaw. The recognition that the man standing in front of her was not the arrogant, indifferent air she'd spent 4 years watching from behind a maid's uniform. He was something else. Something broken and rebuilding, the way she was. Something willing to burn his own house down because the house had been built on graves. The evidence goes through the Monarch's systems, she said, testing the logic, running the permutations. I have access codes. Backup access codes Victor doesn't know about because I created them using the maintenance protocols. The broadcast hits every screen in the building and the live stream simultaneously. By the time Victor realizes we're not at the Albright, it's already playing. And the federal documents, the ones with my name, become irrelevant. Because when 300 financial leaders and a live media feed are watching Victor DeLuca's crimes play across every screen in his own hotel, no prosecutor in the country is going to indict the man who handed them the evidence. They're going to indict the man on the screen. You'll still lose the empire. I lost the empire the moment I found out it was built on my father's blood. Elena looked at him for a long time. The wind moved through her hair, and she pushed it back with a hand that was steady now. Steadier than it had been all week, as if the proximity to action calmed something in her that stillness couldn't reach. Friday, she said. Friday. They drove back to New York in separate vehicles, taking different routes, arriving at the Sunset Park warehouse within 20 minutes of each other. The next 36 hours were a controlled demolition of everything they'd planned and a frantic reconstruction of something new. Elena mapped the Monarch Grand's infrastructure from memory, diagramming the server room, the AV routing, the broadcast uplink, the fiber connections that carried the live stream to external platforms. She tested her access codes remotely, carefully, through anonymized connections, leaving no fingerprint, and confirmed they were still active. The Maid's login credentials she'd created 4 years ago hadn't been deactivated because nobody deactivates a Maid's credentials. Nobody thinks the Maid matters. Damien worked the guest list. The Financial Leadership Summit was a DeLuca-sponsored event, which meant his office controlled invitations. He confirmed attendance of key figures, regulators who had turned blind eyes, bankers who had facilitated transfers, political operatives who had brokered deals. Then he made calls to people who weren't on the guest list but needed to be in the building. A producer at a cable news network who owed him a favor. A federal agent, one of the few Elena had identified as clean, who agreed to be present under the condition of plausible deniability. A documentary filmmaker who had been chasing organized crime stories for a decade and understood that some invitations only come once. Friday arrived like a held breath releasing. 6 p.m. The Monarch Grand Hotel blazed with light on Fifth Avenue. Town cars and limousines lined the block, discharging passengers in evening wear who climbed the marble steps with the practiced ease of people who attended events like this the way others attended church, habitually, ritually, without questioning the institution they were entering. Elena was already inside. She'd entered through the service entrance at 4 p.m., wearing not a maid's uniform but the charcoal blazer and ID badge of a senior AV technician, credentials she'd fabricated that morning using the hotel's own template system that she'd cloned years ago. She moved through the back corridors with the invisibility of someone who belonged, because she did belong. She'd spent 4 years learning every hallway, every stairwell, every blind spot in the camera coverage. The Monarch Grand was the maze she'd built her strategy inside, and tonight, the maze was hers. The server room was on the 3rd floor, behind a door marked Authorized Personnel Only, that required a key card and a 6-digit code. Elena had both. She entered, closed the door behind her, and stood in the hum of machines, racks of servers blinking their green and amber lights, cooling fans whirring, cables running along the ceiling like veins. This was the nervous system of the building. Every screen, every speaker, every broadcast feed routed through this room before reaching the ballroom 12 floors below. She plugged in. The satellite uplink, the briefcase-sized device she'd carried in a catering bag, connected to the hotel's broadcast system through an auxiliary port that had been installed for emergency presentations and never secured because nobody imagined a threat would come from inside the building's own infrastructure. She loaded the files, the financial records, the ledger entries, the surveillance recordings, the audio of Victor DeLuca discussing the Montclair fire with a voice that was calm and businesslike and utterly devoid of remorse. She cued them in sequence: financial crimes first, then the political corruption, then the murder evidence, each piece building on the last like a prosecution's closing argument. Her hands were shaking. After 14 years, after the fire, after the running, after the fake name and the maid's uniform and the years of silence, her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the server rack and felt the vibration of the machines through her palms and told herself that trembling was just energy looking for a direction. She gave it one. She pressed enter. Downstairs, the ballroom was full. 300 guests beneath chandeliers that cost more than most people's houses, holding drinks that cost more than most people's dinners, making conversation about markets and margins and mergers while waiters circulated with silver trays. The screens, 12 of them, mounted on the walls for the summit's presentation, displayed the event logo and a countdown to the keynote address. At 7:47 p.m., the screens flickered. The event logo disappeared. In its place, a document filled the screens. A bank statement showing a wire transfer of $14.2 million from Greystone Holdings, LLC, to an account in the Cayman Islands. The recipient's name was highlighted, Victor DeLuca. The transaction description read, Montclair dissolution, redistribution fee. For 3 seconds, nobody reacted. Financial professionals stared at the screens with the reflexive attention of people trained to read numbers, and the numbers they were reading didn't match the keynote they'd been expecting. Then the audio started. Victor's voice, captured by a microphone Elena had hidden in the penthouse suite 3 years ago, filled the ballroom through the hotel's own speaker system, clear, unmistakable, discussing the logistics of destroying the Montclair financial network, which accounts to seize, which officials to bribe, which records to destroy. Discussing it with the casual efficiency of a man ordering lunch. The ballroom erupted. Not with violence, with panic. The specific contagious panic of powerful people who understand, with sudden and terrible clarity, that they are watching a crime unfold on a screen in a room full of witnesses and cameras, and that the crime is connected to them by invisible threads that are becoming visible in real time. Damien stood near the back of the ballroom. He watched the screens. He watched the faces. He watched 300 people, bankers, politicians, regulators, power brokers, realize that the ground beneath their feet had opened and there was nothing to grab. His phone buzzed. Marco. Victor's here. Lobby. He just walked in. Damien's pulse spiked. Victor wasn't supposed to be here. Victor was supposed to be at the Albright, surrounded by his men, guarding against a threat that wasn't coming. The fact that he was here, at the Monarch Grand, in the lobby, right now, meant one of two things. Either he'd figured out the switch, or someone had told him. Damien moved toward the lobby. His hand was inside his jacket, fingers wrapping around the grip of his Beretta, feeling the cold metal and the textured grip like a handshake from the only thing in his life that had never lied to him. He reached the lobby and saw Victor. Victor DeLuca stood at the center of the marble-floored entrance hall, surrounded by 4 men in dark suits who weren't hotel security and weren't trying to look like they were. Victor himself was wearing a navy overcoat over a gray suit, his silver hair immaculate, his face carrying the expression of mild disappointment that a father wears when a child has misbehaved. He was 61 years old. He looked 50. He moved like 45. And he stared at Damien across the lobby with eyes that held no anger, no surprise, no fear, only the patient, predatory calm of a man who has been waiting for this moment and has already decided how it ends. Nephew, Victor said, his voice carried across the marble. I told you Friday. I told you I'd be ready. You're not at the Albright. Neither are you. We have that in common. Victor unbuttoned his overcoat. A gesture. Casual. The kind of thing a man does when he's settling in. The broadcast is clever. The girl is clever. But clever isn't enough. My attorneys are already on the phone with every network carrying the live stream. Cease and desist orders filed in 3 jurisdictions. Injunctions pending. By the time your little slideshow finishes, the legal framework to suppress it will already be in place. You can't suppress what's already been seen. You'd be surprised what money and lawyers can make people unsee. Victor took a step forward. His men moved with him, synchronized, precise, a choreography of threat. But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because this ends tonight, one way or another. And I'd prefer it end with you walking out of this building with your freedom and your sister and whatever's left of your pride, rather than being carried out in a federal indictment in a body bag. Damien's hand tightened on the Beretta. His heart was pounding in his ears, not with fear, but with the concentrated, crystallized rage of a man standing 6 feet from the person who murdered his father and spent 5 years pretending to mourn him. His vision narrowed. The lobby shrank. The marble and the chandeliers and the 4 men in dark suits all compressed into a single focal point, Victor's face. Victor's calm, composed, maddeningly reasonable face. You killed him, Damien said. His voice was low, steady, and carried the weight of 5 years of misdirected grief. You killed my father, your own brother, and then you stood at his funeral and cried. Something flickered behind Victor's eyes. Brief. Almost invisible. The first crack in the mask. Antonio made his choice. I made mine. History will remember the one who kept the empire standing. History is watching right now. Damien nodded toward the ballroom where the broadcast was still playing, where 300 witnesses were watching 14 years of evidence cascade across every screen. And it's going to remember you as the man who murdered a family for money and then pretended to be a patriarch. Victor's jaw tightened. The crack widened. For the first time, the composure that had carried him through decades of deception showed its seams. Not much, just enough. Just enough for Damien to see the man behind the mask. Not a strategist, not a patriarch, not a calculated pragmatist, but a man who had done a terrible thing and spent his life building walls around it. And those walls were coming down. And the sound they made when they fell was the sound of the broadcast echoing through the Monarch Grand speakers, filling every floor, every hallway, every room with the undeniable evidence of what Victor DeLuca truly was. Victor reached inside his coat. His men reached inside theirs. And Damien pulled the Beretta from his jacket and leveled it at his uncle's chest with a hand that did not shake, that would never shake again, because the time for trembling was over and the time for truth had a gun in its hand and a dead father's name on its lips. "Don't," Damien said. One word, the last word before everything changed. And in the ballroom above them, Elena's voice joined the broadcast. Not recorded, live, speaking into a microphone connected to the hotel's PA system, identifying herself as Elena Montclair, daughter of Theodore and Catherine Montclair, survivor of the fire that was meant to erase her family, and the author of every piece of evidence now playing on every screen in the building and streaming to every news desk in the city, her voice steady and clear and carrying 14 years of silence that had finally found its sound. The lobby of the Monarch Grand Hotel became a tomb of held breath and drawn steel. Damien's Beretta was aimed at Victor's chest, center mass, the way Marco had taught him to shoot when he was 16, back when bullets were theoretical and family meant something that couldn't be bought. Victor's 4 men had their hands inside their jackets, frozen in the half-second between reaching for a weapon and actually pulling it, because every one of them understood that the first man to clear leather was the first man to die. Victor hadn't moved. His hand was still inside his coat, resting on whatever he'd been reaching for. A gun, a phone, a detonator for all Damien knew. His eyes were locked on Damien's, and in them was something Damien had never seen in his uncle's face before. Calculation without confidence. The slight, almost imperceptible widening of the pupils that comes when a man who has always controlled the board realizes, for the first time, that he doesn't know what his opponent's next move is. "You won't shoot me," Victor said. Calm, measured. But the calm was performance now, and they both knew it. "You're not a killer, Damien. Not like this. Not face to face with a man who held you when you were born." "You held my father when he was born too." The words hit Victor like a physical blow. His jaw moved. A tiny, involuntary flex, the kind that happens when a man bites down on something he can't swallow. For 1 second, the mask slipped completely, and what Damien saw underneath was not evil. It was worse than evil. It was exhaustion. The deep, hollowed-out fatigue of a man who had been carrying a monstrous secret for so long that the weight of it had become indistinguishable from his own skeleton. Victor DeLuca was tired, not of the fight, of himself. "Tell your men to put their hands where I can see them," Damien said. "And if I don't? Then this lobby gets very loud and very messy, and the 300 people upstairs watching your crimes on a screen will hear the ending in real time." Victor stared at him. 5 seconds. 10. The longest 10 seconds of Damien's life, including the ones in the parking garage in Newark, including the ones waiting for Nikos's team to breach the Greenwich House, including every second he'd spent in the past 72 hours discovering that the foundation of his entire existence was a lie. Victor lifted his hand from his coat, slowly, fingers spread, empty. "Stand down," he said to his men. His voice was quiet. The voice of a man making a decision he's already made, the surrender that happens internally long before the body follows. His men hesitated. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a shaved head who looked like he'd been recruited from a maximum security yard, glanced at Victor for confirmation. Victor nodded. One by one, the 4 men withdrew their hands from their jackets and placed them at their sides. Marco appeared from the service corridor behind Damien, gun drawn, flanked by 2 of Nikos's men who had been positioned in the hotel since 5 p.m. as a contingency. They moved to the 4 bodyguards with practiced efficiency. Weapons confiscated, wrists zip-tied, faces pressed against the marble wall with the kind of firm indifference that professionals apply to tasks they've performed 100 times. Victor stood alone in the center of the lobby. No men, no weapons, no leverage. Just a 61-year-old man in a navy overcoat whose empire was unraveling in real time 12 floors above his head. Damien lowered his Beretta. Not all the way. To his side, barrel pointed at the floor, fingers still on the trigger guard. He stepped closer to Victor, close enough to see the network of fine lines around his uncle's eyes, the silver stubble on his jaw that suggested he hadn't shaved since yesterday, the slight tremor in his left hand that he was trying to hide by curling his fingers into his palm. "The federal documents," Damien said. "The ones with my name. Where are they?" Victor looked at him with an expression that, in different circumstances, might have been mistaken for affection. "Safe deposit box, Chase Manhattan, Midtown branch, box 417. The key is in my coat pocket." "Marco." Marco approached Victor, reached into his coat pocket and removed a small brass key on a plain ring. He held it up, examined it, then put it in his own pocket without a word. "The copies," Damien said. "Digital." "There are no digital copies. I'm not stupid enough to put something like that on a server." Victor's mouth twitched, almost a smile, almost human. "Paper only. Old school. Your father was the same way. He never trusted computers." The mention of his father sent a tremor through Damien's chest that he controlled by tightening his grip on the Beretta. Not now. Not yet. There would be time for grief later. An ocean of time, an ocean of grief. But right now the operation wasn't finished, and unfinished operations killed people. "Sit down," Damien said, gesturing to a leather bench near the lobby wall. Victor sat. He crossed one leg over the other, adjusted his coat, and looked up at Damien with the posture of a man waiting for a train. Patient, resigned, done. "The broadcast," Victor said. "How long?" "Long enough." "The attorneys I called, the injunctions, they won't hold. I knew that when I filed them. I was buying time." He paused. "I suppose I've run out." "You ran out a long time ago. You just didn't know it." Above them, Elena's voice continued to fill the hotel. Not shouting, not pleading, stating. The measured, relentless delivery of a woman presenting evidence the way a mason lays bricks, each piece supporting the next, each fact building toward an architecture of truth that was too large and too solid to be demolished by lawyers or money or threats. She named names. She cited account numbers. She played recordings. She showed documents side by side, the official version and the real one, and let the audience see the gap between them with their own eyes. In the ballroom, the 300 guests of the Financial Leadership Summit sat in a silence so complete that the hum of the AV equipment was audible. Some had their phones out, recording. Others had their phones pressed to their ears, calling attorneys, calling partners, calling anyone who could tell them what to do when the world cracks open at a dinner party. A handful had tried to leave, but the exits were blocked. Not physically, but by the crush of arriving personnel. Federal agents, summoned by the clean agent Damien had planted in the audience, had entered the building 7 minutes after the broadcast began and were now standing at every door with the calm, implacable presence of people who carry badges and don't need to explain themselves. Senator Richard Ashby was in a bathroom stall trying to flush his phone down the toilet. It wouldn't go. He fished it out, wet and cracked, and sat on the closed lid with his head in his hands, his silver hair falling forward, his career circling the same drain his phone had failed to navigate. Dominic Calabrese was on a bench outside the ballroom, flanked by 2 agents who had asked him to remain seated and available for questions. His cigar was out. His face was gray. He was staring at the carpet with the expression of a man who has just realized that the ground he's been standing on for 30 years was never solid. Lucia Moretti was the only person in the ballroom who hadn't moved. She sat at her table with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on the screen nearest to her, watching the evidence cascade with the quiet attention of a woman who had known, for 14 years, that this day would come and had spent every one of those years wondering whether she would feel relief or terror when it arrived. She felt both. They tasted the same. At 8:32 p.m., the broadcast ended. The screens went dark. The ballroom lights came up, full, bright, merciless, and 300 people blinked in the sudden illumination like creatures pulled from deep water. Elena walked down from the 3rd floor. She'd changed out of the AV technician's blazer and was wearing a simple black dress she'd kept in a duffel bag in the server room. No silver gown, no disguise, no performance. Just Elena Montclair Vale, 28 years old, walking through the corridors of the hotel where she'd scrubbed floors and changed sheets and planted microphones and waited, year after year, for the moment that had just passed. She reached the lobby. She saw Victor on the bench. She saw Damien standing over him. She stopped 10 feet away. Victor looked at her. For a long moment, the two of them held each other's gaze. The man who had ordered her family's murder, and the girl who had survived it, meeting face to face in a marble lobby, while the sound of federal agents reading Miranda rights echoed from the ballroom above. "You look like your mother," Victor said. Elena didn't flinch, didn't react. She looked at him the way you look at a closed chapter. Not with forgiveness, not with hatred, but with the exhausted finality of someone who has carried a weight for so long that setting it down feels less like relief and more like vertigo. "I know," she said, and walked past him to stand beside Damien. The arrests took hours. Federal agents moved through the hotel with the methodical patience of people who understand that rushing a process this large would create loopholes that expensive lawyers could exploit later. They had warrants, they had names, they had, thanks to Elena's broadcast, a body of evidence so comprehensive and so publicly witnessed that the usual mechanisms of suppression, sealed records, confidential settlements, quiet deals in judges' chambers, were functionally useless. You can't seal what 300 people have already seen. You can't suppress what a live stream has already delivered to every newsroom in the country. Victor De Luca was arrested at 9:14 p.m. in the lobby of the Monarch Grand Hotel. He didn't resist. He stood when the agents approached, offered his wrists, and allowed himself to be handcuffed with the composure of a man who had always known this was one of the possible endings and had made his peace with it somewhere in the years between the crime and the consequence. As they led him toward the door, he passed Damien. He stopped. The agents let him, briefly, carefully, the way you let a contained threat have its final moment. "The empire will fall," Victor said. Not as a warning, as a statement of fact, the way a demolition engineer describes a building he's about to bring down. "It already fell," Damien said. "It fell the night you killed my father. Everything since then has been the rubble settling." Victor held his nephew's gaze for 3 seconds. Then he nodded, once, slowly, and let the agents guide him through the front doors of the Monarch Grand into the November night, where a convoy of unmarked sedans waited with their engines running and their back seats empty and their destinations predetermined. Damien watched him go. He watched the door close. He watched the red taillights of the lead sedan disappear down Fifth Avenue, carrying the last surviving DeLuca of his father's generation toward a future measured in court dates and concrete walls. And he felt, not satisfaction, not triumph, a heaviness that settled into his body like wet sand, filling the spaces where rage and purpose had been, leaving behind something dense and shapeless and impossible to name. Marco was beside him, silent, present, standing one step below, the way he always did, even when there were no stairs and no hierarchy left to observe. Marco's face was drawn, lined with the kind of fatigue that accumulates over days of sustained crisis, and doesn't leave when the crisis ends because the body doesn't believe it's over yet. "It's done," Marco said, quietly, testing the words, seeing if they were true. "Yeah. What now?" Damien looked at the lobby. The marble floor was scuffed with boot prints from federal agents. A champagne glass lay on its side near the concierge desk, its contents pooled in a golden stain. The chandeliers still blazed overhead, indifferent, illuminating a room that had hosted power and privilege for decades and would, by morning, be the most famous crime scene in the city. "Now we clean up," Damien said, "the parts that are ours to clean." Over the following weeks, the infrastructure of the DeLuca Empire came apart the way a condemned building comes apart. Not all at once, but in stages, each collapse triggering the next, each removal of a load-bearing wall bringing down the floors above it. The legitimate businesses survived, mostly. The hotels, the real estate holdings, the construction companies that had actual contracts with actual clients for actual buildings. These continued to operate, stripped of the shadow operations that had parasitized them for years. Damien signed over management authority to a board of trustees he selected personally. People with clean hands and hard eyes who understood that the DeLuca name now meant something different and that the difference was non-negotiable. The illegitimate operations, the money laundering, the political bribery, the protection rackets, the silent partnerships with other crime families, these were dismantled. Not quietly, not through backroom negotiations, but through the federal investigation that Elena's broadcast had ignited. Indictments came down like rain in December. 11 men inside the DeLuca organization, the same 11 faces on Elena's corkboard, were arrested within 2 weeks. Sal Benedetto, Tommy Ricci, Paul Corsetti, each one confronted with evidence so specific and so overwhelming that their attorneys recommended cooperation before the arraignment hearings were finished. Senator Ashby resigned on a Tuesday morning, releasing a statement that used the words personal reasons 3 times and family 4 times, and convinced nobody. The federal investigation into his conduct expanded within a month to include 14 other officials, state legislators, city council members, zoning commissioners, judges, whose names appeared in Elena's financial records and Victor's surveillance recordings. The political structure that had enabled the criminal network for 30 years collapsed faster than the criminal network itself, because politicians have elections, and elections have voters, and voters have television screens that had shown them, in high definition, exactly what their representatives had been doing with their trust. Dominic Calabrese turned state's witness in January, trading his testimony for a reduced sentence and a new identity in a state he'd never been to. Lucia Moretti, who had known about the Montclair fire for 14 years and said nothing, was not charged. There was no evidence of her direct involvement, but she withdrew from public life so completely that by spring, most people in her social circle assumed she had died. She hadn't. She was living in a house in the Catskills, alone, tending a garden she didn't care about, reading books she didn't finish, waiting for something she couldn't name but understood was the slow, mundane erosion of guilt, working its way through a life that had too much of it. Philip Crane, the attorney who had helped Elena build her false identity, was interviewed by federal investigators 7 times and told the truth each time. His cooperation, combined with Elena's public testimony, ensured that the evidentiary chain connecting Victor DeLuca to the Montclair murders was airtight. Crane retired in February. He sold his practice, closed his office, and moved to a small house in Vermont where he spent his mornings on the porch drinking coffee and watching the snow and thinking about the things that lawyers see and the things they choose not to. The Montclair estate, the land where the house had burned, where Elena's parents had died, where a 14-year-old girl had crawled through a greenhouse window with a leather ledger pressed against her chest, was returned to Elena through a civil proceeding that took less time than anyone expected because the parties who had illegally seized the property were now either incarcerated or cooperating with the government and had no interest in contesting a claim that would only add to their list of charges. Elena didn't rebuild the house. She stood on the property one morning in March, alone, coatless, the early spring wind cutting through her sweater, and looked at the foundation. It was still there. Concrete and stone, blackened by the fire but structurally intact, the bones of a life that had been destroyed 14 years ago. Grass had grown through the cracks. Small trees had taken root in the corners. The land was reclaiming what had been taken from it, slowly, patiently, the way land always does. She stood there for a long time. Her hands were in her pockets. Her face was still. She wasn't crying. She'd done her crying years ago, in a groundskeeper's truck on a January night, with smoke still in her hair and her parents' ledger still warm against her chest. The tears had been spent. What remained was something drier, something more structural. Not closure. She didn't believe in closure, had never met anyone who'd experienced actual loss and believed in it. What remained was completion. The difference between a wound that's open and a wound that's scarred. Both hurt, but the scar means you survived. She sold the land, used the proceeds, combined with the Montclair assets recovered through the federal investigation, to establish a foundation. Not a charity, a mechanism. An organization that provided legal representation, forensic accounting, and investigative support to families whose members had been killed or disappeared by organized crime and whose cases had been buried by the same systems that were supposed to solve them. She staffed it with people like her: survivors, investigators, accountants who understood that numbers tell stories that words try to hide. She named it after the girl whose remains had been found in the greenhouse and whose identity she had never been able to recover. The foundation's name was simply the Jane Foundation, because every unnamed victim deserved at least that much: a name, even a borrowed one, even a placeholder, even an admission that someone existed and mattered and was gone. Damien disappeared from New York in late January, not dramatically, not a midnight escape or a burned passport or a new identity in a foreign country. He simply stopped being present, stopped attending meetings, stopped returning calls, stopped appearing at the restaurants and clubs and social functions where the DeLuca name had once been a password to every room that mattered. Marco handled the transition, the legal restructuring, the asset transfers, the interviews with federal investigators who needed Damien's cooperation and received it through attorneys and written statements rather than in-person appearances. Damien had cooperated fully. He'd given the feds everything they asked for and more. But cooperation and presence were different things, and Damien had decided, somewhere in the weeks following the Monarch Grand, that his presence in New York was no longer something the city needed or something he could stand. He rented a house in a coastal town in Maine that had 1,200 residents and one stoplight, and a diner where the coffee was terrible and nobody recognized him and the ocean was visible from the porch. He spent mornings walking on the beach, not for exercise, not for contemplation, but because walking was the only thing that made his body feel like it belonged to him again. The salt air scoured something out of his lungs that the city had put there, and each day the scoured space felt a little larger, a little cleaner, a little more like something he could breathe into. Isabella visited in February. She looked better. Color in her face, steadiness in her hands, the beginning of something that might eventually resemble peace if you gave it enough time and didn't look at it too directly. They sat on the porch and drank coffee and talked about things that didn't matter: the weather, the lobster rolls at the shack on the pier, a book she was reading, and the things that did matter sat between them unspoken but acknowledged. The way painful things exist between people who love each other and don't need to narrate their suffering to confirm it's real. "Are you coming back?" she asked. "I don't know." "That's not a no." "It's not a yes either." She smiled, small, tired, genuine. The first genuine smile he'd seen on her face since before the Greenwich House. "You sound like Dad." He looked at her. The comparison hit him in a place he didn't know was still tender, and for a moment his eyes burned and his throat closed and he had to look at the ocean until the feeling passed, which it did, the way waves pass. Not disappearing, just receding, pulling back to gather strength for the next one. "I'll take that," he said. Elena called in April. Not a long call, not an emotional one. Her voice was the same as it had always been, level, precise, carrying the faint European accent she'd stopped hiding, and the conversation was brief and direct, the way their conversations had always been. She told him about the foundation, told him about the Montclair property, told him she was living in an apartment in the West Village, a place with tall windows and too much light, and that she was learning to cook because 14 years of canned food and hot plates had left her with a deficit she intended to correct. "How's the cooking going?" he asked. "Terrible. I burned risotto last night. I didn't know risotto could burn." "Everything burns if you stop paying attention." A pause. The kind of pause that holds more than words, that carries the weight of shared experience and the specific gravity of two people who went through something that changed the shape of their lives and emerged on the other side altered in ways they were still discovering. "I'm having an event in June," Elena said. "The Foundation's first public fundraiser. Small, 50 people. Nothing like a gala." "Nothing like a gala." Another pause. "I'd like you to be there. Not as a DeLuca, not as anything. Just as someone I'd like to see in a room." Damien looked out the window of his main house. The ocean was doing what the ocean always does, moving, retreating, returning, indifferent to the affairs of the people who stood on its edges and tried to make sense of their lives. He thought about the ballroom. the silver gown, the moment she'd walked through the doors and every laugh in the room had died. He thought about the warehouse in Sunset Park, the corkboard, the red string, the 14 years of patience compressed into a single evening of exposure. He thought about a woman who had been treated like furniture with a heartbeat and had turned out to be the most dangerous person in the room. "Yeah," he said. "I'll be there." The event was held on a warm evening in early June in the garden of a townhouse in the village that belonged to one of the foundation's board members. 50 guests, candles on iron tables, wine that was good but not extravagant, waiters who were paid fairly and looked people in the eye, no chandeliers, no marble, no string quartets playing Vivaldi like a funeral dirge. Just people, standing in the fading light, talking about things that mattered to them, eating food that someone had cooked with care, existing in a space that had been built for purpose rather than performance. Elena stood at the far end of the garden near a stone wall covered in climbing jasmine. She wore a dark blue dress, simple, unfussy, the kind of thing a woman wears when she's no longer trying to make an impression, and has discovered that the absence of effort is its own kind of elegance. Her hair was down. Her hands were wrapped around a glass of wine she was actually drinking, which Damien noticed because at every previous event he'd seen her attend, she'd held drinks like props and never tasted them. He walked toward her. Through the garden, past the tables, past the quiet conversations and the candlelight and the warm June air that smelled like jasmine and city rain. She saw him coming and didn't move, didn't straighten, didn't adjust her expression, just watched him approach with those dark brown eyes that he'd first seen in a ballroom full of killers and thieves, and that had looked, even then, like they belonged to someone who had already survived the worst the world could do. He stopped 3 feet away. Their distance. The space they'd maintained since the night they met. Close enough to speak, far enough to think. But tonight, in this garden, with the candles flickering and the jasmine blooming, and the weight of everything they'd been through humming between them like a frequency only they could hear, 3 feet felt like a choice rather than a habit, and choices could be changed. "You came," she said. "I said I would. People say a lot of things. I'm not people." She looked at him. A long look. The kind that takes inventory. Not of appearance, not of status, but of substance. The kind of look that asks a question without words and waits for an answer that words can't provide. Then she stepped forward. 1 step. Closing the distance by half. 18 inches between them now. Close enough that he could see the pulse in her throat, the fine lines at the corners of her eyes that hadn't been there a year ago, the almost invisible scar on her collarbone that she'd never explained, and he'd never asked about because some histories announce themselves and some wait to be invited. "The risotto," she said. "I finally got it right." "Yeah?" "Took me 6 tries, ruined 3 pans. But the 7th time it was perfect." She took a sip of wine. "I think there's a lesson in that, but I'm too tired for metaphors." Damien smiled. Not the controlled fractional smile he'd worn for years. The one that communicated power rather than feeling, strategy rather than warmth. This was different. Smaller. Realer. The smile of a man who had lost an empire and a father and an uncle and every illusion he'd ever maintained and had discovered, in the wreckage, something that the empire had been blocking from view. Not happiness, he didn't trust that word yet, might never trust it fully, but the possibility of it. The distant, approaching, terrifying possibility that a man who had been defined by what he controlled could learn to be defined instead by what he chose. He closed the remaining distance. 12 inches, 6. Close enough to touch. Close enough that when he spoke, his voice was barely louder than the hum of the garden and the city beyond it. "I'm glad you survived," he said. Not eloquent, not romantic, just true. The truest thing he'd said in years, maybe ever, standing in a garden in the village with a woman who had been a maid and a ghost and a weapon and was now, finally, just a person. A person who had earned every scar she carried and had decided, after 14 years in the dark, to stand in the light and see what grew there. Elena looked up at him. Her eyes held something he recognized because it matched something in his own. Not love, not yet, but the raw material of it. The willingness. The terrifying, exhilarating willingness to build something new on ground that had been scorched, knowing that scorched ground is still ground, and ground is where things grow. She didn't say anything. She reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were warm from the wine glass, and they wrapped around his with a grip that was firm and certain and unhesitating, the grip of a woman who had spent 14 years holding on to things in the dark and had finally found something worth holding in the light. They stood there, hand in hand, in a garden full of candles and jasmine and 50 people who didn't know the full story and didn't need to. The city hummed around them, sirens, traffic, the restless pulse of 10 million lives being lived in rooms and streets and towers that would never know what had happened in a ballroom on the Upper East Side on a November night, or in a warehouse in Sunset Park, or in the lobby of the Monarch Grand Hotel, or in any of the 100 small, brutal, beautiful moments that had led two broken people to this garden, this evening, this single point of stillness in a world that never stopped moving. The candles burned, the jasmine climbed, and Elena Montclair Vale, the woman they had once called a maid, stood in the center of a life she had built from ashes and held the hand of a man who had chosen to let his empire fall so that something better could stand in its place. Not a queen, not a weapon, not a ghost, just a woman who had survived and a man who was learning to, and the garden around them that didn't care about empires or vengeance or the terrible arithmetic of power, only about light and soil and the stubborn insistence of living things to grow.